The clay tablet rests in a climate-controlled vault beneath London, surrounded by thousands of its companions, each one a fragment of voices that fell silent millennia ago. This particular tablet, catalogued as K335 in the British Museum's collection, measures roughly 6 in across. Its surface bears the wedge-shaped impressions of ununiform script pressed into wet clay sometime around 650 BCE in the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh. The tablet itself is unremarkable in appearance. Reddish-brown, corners chipped, one edge crumbling slightly where time and handling have taken their toll. But in December of 1872, when a self-taught scholar named George Smith sat in the museum's manuscript room deciphering this tablet's contents, he suddenly stood up, set down his papers, and in his excitement began removing his clothing. The tablet, recovered from the ruins of King Ashur-banipal's library during excavations in what is now Iraq, contained a story, not just any story, but an account of a great flood that destroyed the world. A righteous man warned by the gods. A boat constructed to specific dimensions. Animals brought aboard in pairs. Waters that covered the earth. A single mountain peak where the vessel came to rest. 7 days of waiting before the survivor sent out birds to test whether the waters had receded. George Smith was looking at the oldest written account of the biblical flood narrative, predating Hebrew scripture by more than 1,000 years. But he was reading something else as well, though perhaps he didn't fully realize it in that moment of discovery. He was reading the same event that the Greek philosopher Plato described when he wrote about the destruction of Atlantis. The same catastrophic loss of an advanced civilization, the same waters rising to consume what came before, the same memory preserved in clay of something that the ancient world could not forget. What if the story we've been told about Atlantis being purely allegorical fiction is incomplete? What if Plato's account and the Sumerian flood narratives are not separate myths, but two different cultural memories of the same real event? What if the oldest written records in human history are trying to tell us what actually destroyed an advanced civilization at the end of the last ice age? This isn't a question about whether Atlantis was literally located beyond the Pillars of Hercules as Plato described. This is a question about whether both Greek and Mesopotamian sources preserved fragmented memories of a genuine catastrophe that reshaped the ancient world. A catastrophe that geological evidence now suggests occurred precisely when Plato said it did around 9600 BCE, at the boundary between the Younger Dews and the beginning of our current warm period. The Sumerian records don't use the word Atlantis. They speak instead of cities that existed before the flood of kingship that descended from heaven to these antediluvian settlements, and of knowledge that was preserved by a handful of survivors who rebuilt civilization after the waters receded. They speak of this not as metaphor or moral teaching, but as something their scribes copied and recopied across centuries, maintaining lists of kings who ruled before and after the deluge, documenting the event with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to recording grain harvests and temple inventories. If you're settling into, listen wherever you are in the world right now, perhaps you could take a moment to share where you're listening from in the comments. There's something connecting about knowing this question is being contemplated simultaneously by people across different time zones, different contexts, all wondering together about what really happened when the ancient world speaks with such consistency about waters that rose and destroyed what came before. The question isn't simple. It can't be answered with certainty even now, despite more than a century and a half of archaeological excavation, translation, and analysis. But the question deserves to be asked carefully, with attention to what the oldest written records actually say, to what physical evidence supports, and to what mainstream scholarship has perhaps too quickly dismissed as impossible. Because when you place the Sumerian tablets beside Plato's dialogues, beside the geological record of the Younger Dryas' termination, beside the archaeological evidence of flood deposits at ancient Mesopotamian sites, a pattern begins to emerge. Not proof, but pattern. Not certainty, but suggestion. The kind of correspondence that makes you wonder whether civilization separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles somehow retained fragments of the same catastrophic memory. This is the investigation that follows. Not a claim of what happened, but an examination of what the evidence suggests might have happened. Not a dismissal of scholarly consensus, but a questioning of whether that consensus has fully accounted for the weight of what these ancient sources are trying to communicate. The story begins, as many ancient stories do, with cities that no longer exist. Cities. Before the waters came, the Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia with a civilization already formed. This is one of the enduring puzzles of ancient history. Around 3500 BCE. In the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where Iraq sits today, we find suddenly not nomadic settlements or simple farming communities, but cities, urban centers with monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, administrative bureaucracies, and most remarkably, a fully developed writing system. Writing, as far as we can trace it, began here. The earliest examples of ununiform script date to around 3400 BCE, found in the city of Uruk. These aren't primitive scratches or pictographic experiments. They're sophisticated administrative records already using abstract symbols to represent sounds already embedded in a functioning system of accounting and documentation, as if writing emerged fully formed rather than evolving gradually through stages of development. The mainstream view is that we simply haven't found the earlier developmental stages, that somewhere beneath the archaeological layers already excavated or in regions not yet investigated, there must exist evidence of writing's gradual invention. This is reasonable. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But it's worth noting that despite more than a century of intensive excavation across Mesopotamia, no such developmental stages have been discovered. The Sumerians themselves had a different explanation for their civilization's origins. They said it was given to them. Specifically, they said it came from survivors of an earlier time, from before the Great Flood that divided their history into two distinct epochs. This wasn't a casual claim or a piece of minor mythology. It was fundamental to how they understood themselves and their place in time's flow. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University sits a clay prism 8, in tall, four-sided, covered with columns of ununiform text. This is the Weld Blundell prism, catalogued as WB 1923-44, the most complete surviving copy of what scholars call the Sumerian king list. The prism dates to approximately 1800 BCE, but the list it preserves is much older, compiled around 2000 BCE, and drawing from sources that extend back another 1,000 years. The king list begins with a statement. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Erodu, not when kingship was invented or established, but lowered given from above. The text then proceeds to name 8 kings who ruled in 5 cities before the flood. These antediluvian rulers are given extraordinary reign lengths. Alulim, the first king, ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Alagar, his successor, ruled for 36,000 years. The numbers continue in this impossible scale through all 8 pre-flood kings, totaling 2,400 years of kingship before the catastrophe. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After this dividing line, the king list continues with post-flood dynasties. But something has fundamentally changed. The reign lengths, while still inflated by later historical standards, drop dramatically. Post-flood kings rule for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. The Sumerian scribes, meticulous record keepers who tracked grain supplies down to individual bushels, were marking a distinction. Something happened. Something that separated the deep past from the reconstructed present. The 5 antediluvian cities named in the king list are Eridu, Bad, Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak. These aren't mythical locations. Archaeological excavations have identified the physical sites of these cities. Eridu, described in Sumerian sources as the first city ever built, lies in southern Iraq, near the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf. Excavations there in the 1940s and 1950s revealed a sequence of temple platforms extending back to approximately 5000 BCE, making it among the oldest continuously occupied sacred sites in Mesopotamia. Shuhupak, the home city of Zusudra. The Sumerian flood hero was excavated beginning in 1902 by Robert Kului and Friedrich Delitzsch, then later by teams in the 1930s. They found a thick layer of water deposited clay sediment within the archaeological sequence, suggesting the city experienced severe flooding sometime around 2900–2600 BCE. The flood layer wasn't universal across the entire region, but it was substantial enough to destroy the city and leave clear stratigraphic evidence of catastrophe. The Sumerians weren't claiming that their entire civilization dated back 200 years. The impossible numbers in the antediluvian section of the King List have been interpreted variously as astronomical calculations, as symbolic representations of sacred numerology, or as the result of confusion between different calendar systems. What matters isn't the literal accuracy of the timeframes, but what the structure of the list reveals about Sumerian historical consciousness. They believed there was a before and after, a time when things were different, when knowledge and civilization existed in forms that were lost and then partially recovered. The post-flood world, in their view, wasn't the origin of civilization, but its restoration. Kingship didn't begin after the flood. It was lowered from heaven again. The phrasing implies continuity with what came before, not fresh creation. This same division between antediluvian and post-Diluvian worlds appears consistently across Sumerian and later Babylonian literature. The Erodu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives, explicitly frames the story as beginning in a time when 5 cities already existed, already functioning as centers of civilization. The god Enki warns Zusudra, king of Shurupak, about the coming deluge. Zusudra builds a boat according to specific divine instructions, preserves representatives of animal life, and after the waters subside, re-establishes civilization. But here's what makes this account different from how we typically think about flood myths. The Erogenesis isn't framed as the origin of humanity or the beginning of social order. It's framed as a crisis of preservation. The question isn't whether civilization will begin, but whether it will survive. The survivor's task isn't to invent agriculture, architecture, or writing, but to carry forward what already existed. In the Atrasis epic, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period around 1600 BCE, the pre-flood world is described as having cities, organized labor forces, extensive agricultural systems, and sufficient technological sophistication to irritate the gods with noise pollution. The story isn't about primitive humans living in a garden. It's about an organized, complex urban civilization that the gods decide to destroy because it has become too numerous and too disruptive. The hero Atrasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, is warned by the god Enki and instructed to build a boat. The instructions include specific measurements. The vessel is to be a cube, approximately 120 cubits on each side, with multiple decks and compartments. These aren't vague mythological details. They're engineering specifications, the kind of information you'd need if you were actually trying to construct a massive floating vessel. When the flood comes in, the Atrasis narrative is described with procedural detail. 7 days and 7 nights of rain. The storm's intensity building in stages. The water levels rising past recognizable landmarks. The isolation and terror of those on the boat cut off from any evidence that land still exists. Then the gradual subsidence, the boat grounding on a mountain, the sending out of birds to test whether the waters have receded enough for disembarkation, the sacrifice offered by the survivor once he reaches dry ground. These accounts appear across multiple tablets from different time periods from different cities in Mesopotamia. They're not identical. Each version has variations in detail, different emphases, different theological frameworks, but they agree on the fundamental narrative structure and on the division of history into before and after the waters. This pattern of agreement across sources is what gives these accounts their evidential weight. When later cultures retold flood stories, they typically adapted them to their own contexts, to their own gods, to their own geographical understanding. but the Mesopotamian versions maintain consistent structural elements across centuries of transmission. The same 5 antediluvian cities, the same basic measurements for the ark, the same pattern of divine warning, construction, catastrophe, survival, and restoration. The Sumerians and the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures that followed them were not pre-scientific. They observed the natural world carefully. They developed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. They distinguished between different types of knowledge and different types of claims. When they recorded business transactions, they were precise. When they recorded astronomical observations, they were accurate. When they recorded sacred narratives, they marked them as such with appropriate literary framing. The flood narratives appear across all these categories. They're referenced in business documents that date property ownership from before the flood. They appear in royal inscriptions where kings claim to have restored what existed in antediluvian times. They appear in scribal school texts where students copied and recopied the accounts as part of their education. The flood wasn't treated as a minor mythological aside. It was treated as the central dividing event in historical memory. What the Sumerians were describing in their own conceptual language was the loss and partial recovery of civilization. They weren't claiming direct continuity with cities that existed tens of thousands of years before, but they were claiming that the civilization they inhabited wasn't invented from nothing by their immediate ancestors. It was restored, rebuilt, remembered from something that existed before the catastrophe. This is the claim we need to examine carefully. Not whether the specific numbers are accurate, not whether the gods literally spoke to the survivors, but whether the fundamental assertion of civilization interrupted and then restored has any correspondence to what actually happened in human history at the end of the last ice age. Because if we take seriously the possibility that the Sumerians were preserving a genuine historical memory, even if imperfectly and embedded in theological interpretation, then we have to ask what event they were remembering. What catastrophe was significant enough to divide their entire conception of history? What happened to the cities that came before? The answer might be preserved not just in the clay tablets they left behind, but in the work of a Greek philosopher writing 2,400 years ago, describing a civilization destroyed by earthquake and flood in a single day and night. A civilization he claimed existed 9,000 years before his sources told him about it. A civilization lost beneath the waves when the world changed suddenly and catastrophically at the boundary between 2 different climatic epochs. To understand how these pieces might fit together, we need first to understand how we can read what the Sumerians wrote at all. Because for 2,000 years after the last ununiform tablet was inscribed, no one on earth could read what they had preserved. The weight of the last person who could read ununiform script probably died sometime in the 1st century CE. By then, the ancient Mesopotamian languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, had been displaced by Aramaic, Greek, and eventually Arabic. The great libraries of clay tablets were abandoned, buried under accumulating sand and debris. The wedge-shaped impressions that recorded 3,000 years of human thought, commerce, prayer, and memory became meaningless marks on broken pottery. For nearly 18 centuries, no living human could decipher what the tablets said. They became curiosities collected by travelers, decorative objects, archaeological puzzles. When European explorers began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the early 19th century, they found thousands of tablets, but had no key to unlock their meaning. The tablets might as well have been blank stones for all the information they could provide. The breakthrough came gradually through the combined efforts of multiple scholars working across decades. The decipherment of cuneiform ranks among the most remarkable achievements in linguistic archaeology. Because unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, which was decoded using the trilingual Rosetta Stone, cuneiform had to be cracked with minimal parallel texts and no living speakers to guide the process. The key insight came from the Behistun inscription, a massive rock carving on a cliff face in western Iran. The inscription created by the Persian king Darius I around 52 E repeated the same text in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. British officer Henry Rawlinson risked his life in the 1830s and 1840s, copying the inscription from its precarious cliffside location, dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground to make paper molds of the ununiform symbols. Old Persian ununiform was the simplest of the 3 scripts, and scholars had already made progress deciphering it based on known royal names and educated guesses about the Persian language's structure. Once Rawlinson and others could read the Old Persian version of the Behistun inscription, they had a framework for approaching the more complex Babylonian version. The Babylonian text used hundreds of signs rather than the few dozen in Old Persian, representing not just sounds, but whole words and concepts. By the 1850s, scholars could read Babylonian ununiform with reasonable confidence. In 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society conducted a test. They gave 4 different scholars, Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, Julius Oppert, and William Henry Fox Talbot, the same unpublished ununiform tablet, and asked each to prepare an independent translation. When the translations were compared, they agreed substantially on the text's meaning. This confirmed that ununiform wasn't being arbitrarily interpreted. It could be read systematically and accurately, but Babylonian ununiform, sophisticated as it was, represented a late stage of the writing system. The earliest ununiform was Sumerian, written in a language unrelated to any known language family. Sumerian used the same wedge-shaped script, but the symbols had different values, and the grammar followed completely different principles from Semitic languages like Babylonian or Assyrian. Fortunately for modern scholars, the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians had the same problem. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 1st millennium BCE, Sumerian had been dead as a spoken language for more than 1,000 years. But it remained the language of scholarship, religion, and high culture. Much like Latin in medieval Europe, scribal schools taught Sumerian to students whose native language was Adian, and they created bilingual dictionaries, grammatical texts, and parallel translations to make Sumerian literature accessible. These ancient study aids became modern Rosetta Stones. When 19th century scholars excavated libraries like the one at Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh, they found not just single-language texts, but bilingual tablets with Sumerian on one side and Adian translation on the other. Once scholars could read Akkadian, they could use these ancient teaching materials to learn Sumerian, following the same path that Assyrian scribes had walked 2 millennia earlier. The process was painstaking. Each symbol in uniform could have multiple readings depending on context. A single sign might represent a sound or a word or a grammatical marker. The same sign could have different meanings in Sumerian than in Adian. And the symbols themselves evolved over time, with signs in early Sumerian looking quite different from their later Babylonian forms. But ununiform had advantages that made accurate translation possible. Unlike alphabetic scripts, where a single symbol represents a single sound, ununiform's complexity created redundancy. Texts often spelled words multiple ways using sound signs, phonograms alongside meaning signs, logs. This redundancy helped modern scholars check their interpretations. If a word appeared in multiple contexts with different spellings, the meanings had to align across all instances. Moreover, clay tablets preserve text remarkably well. Unlike papyrus, parchment or paper which decay, burn, or crumble, baked clay tablets can survive millennia of burial intact. Fire doesn't destroy them. It hardens them further. Water damage is minimal once the clay is fully baked. The tablets excavated from Mesopotamian sites often look much as they did the day they were inscribed, making paleographic analysis precise. The sheer volume of tablets also supports accuracy in translation. The British Museum alone holds approximately 130,000 ununiform tablets and fragments. The University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Louvre, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, the Iraq Museum, each houses tens of thousands more. This massive corpus means that most words and phrases appear across multiple documents in multiple contexts, allowing scholars to verify meanings through cross-reference. Administrative documents are particularly valuable for establishing vocabulary. When a tablet lists deliveries of grain, livestock, or building materials with attached numbers, the context makes meanings clear. Religious and literary texts can be ambiguous, but business records are concrete. If a tablet says a temple received 500 units of barley and 30 sheep, and the symbols for barley and sheep appear consistently across thousands of economic documents, we can be confident we're reading those words correctly. By the late 19th century, cuneiform literacy was well established in European and American universities. Scholars could read most texts with confidence, though debate continued over difficult passages, rare words, and theological nuances. The tablets stopped being mysterious artifacts and became historical sources, as readable as Greek or Latin to those trained in the languages. This matters for our investigation, because it means the flood narratives we're examining aren't modern speculations or creative interpretation. They're direct readings of ancient texts that multiple independent scholars have translated and verified: the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the flood account in Gilgamesh. These aren't reconstructions or guesswork. They're preserved in clay, readable, and consistent across multiple copies. When George Smith announced his discovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative in 1872, he wasn't making an educated guess about what the tablet might say. He was reading it. The tablet K3375 from Ashurbanipal's library contained roughly 300 lines of text describing the flood. Smith could pass the grammar, recognize the vocabulary, and translate the narrative with the same confidence a classicist would have translating Homer. The text begins with Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, seeking the secret of immortality from Utnapishtim, a distant ancestor who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh his story. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. The god A, who had created humans, regretted this decision and warned Utnapishtim by speaking to the reed wall of his house. The instructions were specific. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon wealth, seek life, spurn possessions, save life. Bring aboard the boat seed of all living things. The boat's dimensions are recorded: 12 cubits on each side, 7 decks divided into 9 compartments. Utnapishtim loaded his family, craftsmen, wild animals, and domestic animals. The storm came with unprecedented fury. Even the gods were terrified by what they had unleashed. The waters covered everything for 6 days and 7 nights. On the 7th day, the storm abated. The boat grounded on Mount Naimush. Utnapishtim waited 7 more days, then sent out a dove. It found no resting place and returned. He sent a swallow. It too returned. Finally, he sent a raven. The raven found receding waters, ate, circled, but did not return. Then Utnapishtim knew the earth was drying. This is not vague mythology. It's detailed narrative with geographical specifics, temporal sequences, and procedural descriptions. The account Smith was reading had been copied from earlier versions, preserved across centuries, maintained in royal libraries because it was considered important knowledge about the past. 3 years after Smith's announcement, he returned to Mesopotamia to search for missing fragments of the Gilgamesh tablets. He found additional pieces, filled in more of the text, and confirmed that the flood narrative was part of a larger epic about the search for immortality and the limits of human life. He died of dysentery during this expedition at age 36, never fully realizing the implications of what he had discovered. Because the Gilgamesh tablet wasn't isolated evidence, as excavations continued into the 20th century, more flood texts emerged. The Atrahasis epic appeared on multiple tablets from different sites. The Eridu was found at Nippur. Fragmentary versions showed up at at Sippa, at sites across Mesopotamia. Each text varied in details, but the core narrative remained consistent. There was a flood. It was catastrophic. A single man was warned and preserved life. Civilization continued after the waters receded. The consistency across these sources isn't evidence of copying from a single original. The texts are genuinely independent compositions, written in different periods in different languages for different purposes. They agree because they're preserving the same cultural memory, the same understanding of a dividing event in deep history. This is what makes the Sumerian flood narratives evidentially significant. We're not dealing with a single text that might be idiosyncratic invention. We're dealing with a multi-source tradition maintained across centuries, preserved in a writing system we can definitively read, verified through archaeological excavation of the cities mentioned in the accounts. The tablets exist. They're in museums, cataloged, translated, available for anyone with uniform literacy to verify. The flood they describe wasn't a local inconvenience or a seasonal inundation. It was the flood-definite article. The catastrophe that required no further specification, because everyone in Mesopotamian culture knew what the flood meant. Now, we need to look more closely at what these accounts actually say. Not just that there was a flood, but how they describe it, what details they preserve, and what those details might suggest about the nature of the event they're documenting. Three tellings of the same story. The Eridu Genesis exists on a single badly damaged tablet, CBS 10673, housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The tablet was excavated at Nippur, one of ancient Sumer's most important religious centers, and dates to approximately 1600 BCE. Though it preserves a narrative composed several centuries earlier, about 23 of the original text is lost. But what remains can be partially reconstructed by comparison with later versions and with references in other Sumerian texts. The tablet begins with creation, the forming of humanity, the establishment of kingship, the founding of cities. The narrative doesn't describe a pristine paradise or a simple agricultural settlement. It describes urban civilization. 5 cities are named Eridu, Bad Tibura, Larak, Saipak. These aren't temporary encampments. They're permanent population centers with administrative structures, temples, and agricultural hinterlands. The text mentions irrigation, the institution of kingship, and the assignment of divine patrons to each city. Then comes a break in the tablet. The text resumes with the god Enki, patron of wisdom and water, speaking to a king named Zusudra. The exact warning is lost in the damaged portion, but context from later parallels makes clear that Enki is revealing the god's decision to destroy humanity with a flood. Enki tells Zusudra to build a large boat, though the specific dimensions are in the missing section. The fragmentary text includes references to animals and to the storms coming. What survives clearly describe the flood itself. All the windstorms and gales all together went, and the flood swept over the cult centers. After for 7 days and 7 nights the flood had swept over the land, and the huge boat had been tossed about on the great waters. Came forth, he who sheds light on heaven and earth. Judra opened a window of the huge boat, and the hero Utu brought his rays into the giant boat. The number 7 appears repeatedly in these accounts. 7 days, 7 nights, 7 more days of waiting. This might be symbolic, or it might represent a genuine memory of the catastrophe's duration. What matters is the consistency. The Eridu Genesis, the earliest written version, establishes patterns that later accounts maintain. After the flood subsides, Zusudra makes offerings to the gods, An and Anel. They grant him eternal life and place him in Dilmun, the land where the sun rises, essentially translating him to a paradise beyond normal human reach. The text ends fragmentarily, but the implication is clear. Zusudra becomes immortal because he preserved life through the catastrophe. His reward isn't just personal survival, but transformation into something beyond ordinary humanity. The second major account, the Atrahasis epic, survives in better condition. Multiple tablets from different periods preserve the text, with the most complete version coming from tablets BM 78941 and related fragments in the British Museum dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1600 BCE. The story is longer and more detailed than the Eridu Genesis, providing context that the earlier text assumes. Atrahasis begins not with the creation of humanity, but with the creation myth's economic premise. The younger gods grow weary of the agricultural labor required to sustain the divine community. They complain to Enlil, the chief god, demanding relief from their burdens. The solution is to create humanity to serve as workers, taking over the gods' agricultural tasks. Humans are formed from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, giving humanity both earthly substance and divine consciousness. This creation succeeds too well. Humanity multiplies rapidly, fills the earth, builds cities, develops technology and culture. But the expanding population creates noise that disturbs the gods' rest. After several failed attempts to reduce human numbers through plague and drought, the gods decide on total destruction through flood. Enlil decrees that humanity will be wiped out completely. Enki, who crafted humanity and feels responsibility for his creation, cannot directly oppose Enlil's decree. Instead, he warns his devotee Atrahasis indirectly by speaking to the reed walls of Atrahasis's house. The boat instructions are detailed. Roof it over like the apse, meaning construct it like the underground freshwater ocean, completely enclosed. The vessel should be approximately equal in length, width, and height, 120 cubits in each dimension. It should have multiple decks and be divided into compartments. Atrars should seal it thoroughly with bitumen both inside and out. Atrars follows these instructions precisely. The text describes his gathering of pitch, his requisitioning of materials, his family's involvement in construction. He loads the boat with silver and gold, not abandoning wealth after all, plus his family, craftsmen, to preserve technical knowledge, and representatives of animal life, both domestic and wild. Then he enters the boat and seals the door. The storm arrives with apocalyptic force. Adad, the storm god, thunders in the clouds. The Anunnaki, the divine council, raise their torches, setting fire to the land with their lightning. Darkness descends at noon. The storm's fury continues for 7 days and 7 nights. Even the gods are terrified by what they've unleashed. They retreat to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs, according to the text. When the flood finally subsides, the gods realize with horror what they've lost. Humanity is gone. No one remains to provide offerings, to maintain temples, to serve divine needs. The goddess Ishtar weeps, lamenting that she agreed to this destruction. She declares she will never forget this catastrophe, comparing it to lapis lazuli that she'll wear as a permanent memorial. Atrahas's boat grounds on a mountain. He waits, then opens a hatch, and sunlight floods in. He makes offerings, slaughtering animals and presenting them to the gods. The gods starving for sacrificial offerings swarm around the smoke like flies. This is a remarkable image. Gods reduced to desperate hunger dependent on human worship. Realizing too late that they need humanity as much as humanity needs them. Enlil, seeing that someone survived, is furious that his decree was thwarted. He demands to know who revealed the secret. Enki admits his action but argues that complete destruction was unjust. A compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but its lifespan will be limited, and its reproduction constrained through stillbirths, celibacy requirements for some priestesses, and other fertility limitations. The eternal life formerly available to humans is revoked except for Atrahasis and his wife, who are granted divine status and relocated beyond normal geography. The third major account appears in Tablet, the sheave of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous of all ununiform literary works. The flood story here serves a specific narrative purpose, explaining why Gilgamesh, despite his heroic stature, cannot achieve immortality. The hero travels to find Utnapishtim, known as the Far Away, the one human who attained eternal life. When Gilgamesh asks how this was possible, Utnapishtim tells his story. The narrative parallels Atrahasis closely, but adds details. The city is specifically identified as Shirupak, a city which lies on the Euphrates. This geographical precision isn't incidental. The text is grounding the story in recognizable reality. Utnapishtim describes the divine council's decision to send the flood's warning through the reed wall and the boat's construction with the same dimensions as in Atrasis 100,000, 20 cubits on each side, 7 stories, 9 compartments. But the Gilgamesh version includes additional procedural details. But Napishtim describes organizing the work crew, providing them with food and drink, holding a completion celebration. He loads not just animals and family, but craftsmen, explaining everything I had, I loaded on board. Whatever silver I had, whatever gold I had, and whatever living creatures I had, the preservation of metallurgical knowledge and precious materials suggests not just survival, but the continuation of civilization's technological capacity. The storm description in Gilgamesh is particularly vivid. At dawn, there arose on the horizon a black cloud. Adad was thundering within. Shul and Hanish were going before, going like heralds over mountain and land. Erekal was pulling out the mooring poles. Ninurta came, making the dikes overflow. The Anunnaki raised the torches. With their flare, they lit up the land. Her dad's devastation reached the heavens, turning all light to darkness. This isn't generic disaster description. It's specific. Horizon darkening, thunder, advanced winds, dam failures, fires, light extinction. These are observational details, the kind someone experiencing such an event would remember and record. The text continues. For one day the windstorm blew, gathering speed as it went, submerging mountains, overtaking people like a battle. Brother could not see brother. People could not be recognized from the heavens. Even the gods were afraid of the deluge. They withdrew. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouching outside. On the 7th day, the storm calms. Utnapishtim opens a hatch and sunlight falls on his face. He looks out over a featureless plain of water where the world had been, and he weeps. But then the text adds a crucial detail. Toward the 4 winds, areas of land were emerging. Not a single mountain peak. Multiple areas of land beginning to appear as waters recede. The boat grounds on Mount Nimush, identified with mountains in the Zagros range east of Mesopotamia. Utnapishtim waits 7 days, then sends out birds in sequence. First, a dove, which finds nowhere to land and returns. Then a swallow, which also returns. Finally, a raven, which finds receding waters, eats carrion, and doesn't come back. Only then does Utnapishtim know it's safe to disembark. He releases all the animals, makes a sacrifice, and watches as the gods gather around the offering smoke like fly. Ishtar arrives wearing her lapis lazuli necklace, declaring she will remember this day forever. Enlil, furious that anyone survived, confronts Ea, who defends his action and argues for moderation in divine judgment. Finally, Enlil relents. He comes aboard the boat, takes Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand and declares, "Formerly Utnapishtim was a mortal man, but now he and his wife shall become like us gods. Utnapishtim shall dwell far away at the mouth of the rivers." These 3 accounts, Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, come from different periods, different scribal traditions, different contexts. The Eridu Genesis is purely Sumerian. Atrasis is Old Babylonian written in Akkadian, but preserving Sumerian cultural memory. The Gilgamesh flood story is Neo-Assyrian, copied in the royal library at Nineveh in the 7th century BCE, from sources centuries older, yet they agree on fundamental elements. A decision to destroy humanity through flood. A single righteous man warned by a dissenting god. Specific construction instructions for a large boat. The preservation of animal life. A storm of extraordinary violence lasting 7 days and nights. Waters covering the boat grounding on a mountain. The sending of birds to test conditions. A sacrifice offered upon emergence. The survivor granted immortality or divine status. The continuation of human civilization from this preserved remnant. The variations between versions aren't contradictions. They're the natural divergence that occurs when different communities preserve the same core memory through different transmission chains. If these accounts were purely invented fiction or religious allegory, we'd expect either complete uniformity, suggesting copying from a single text, or complete divergence, suggesting independent invention. Instead, we get something in between. Consistent structure with variable details. This is the pattern of genuine cultural memory maintained across generations. The accounts don't read like moral fables or theological abstractions. They read like descriptions of an actual event, preserved through oral tradition, and eventually committed to writing by cultures that considered this history not metaphor. The procedural details, boat dimensions, storm duration, bird sequences don't serve obvious symbolic functions. They serve documentary functions, the kind of specifics that survivors would remember and transmit to descendants. But these aren't the only flood accounts from the ancient world. While Mesopotamian texts provide the oldest written versions, flood narratives appear across multiple cultures worldwide, each describing similar catastrophes in their own geographical and cultural contexts. The global distribution of these stories has been noted for centuries, often dismissed as coincidence or universal myth-making. But what if the distribution isn't coincidental? What if multiple cultures preserved memories of the same global event, filtered through different languages and frameworks? To evaluate that possibility, we need to examine one particular flood account that doesn't come from Mesopotamia, but from Greece. An account given by a philosopher describing a civilization destroyed by earthquake and flood in a single day and night. A civilization that existed, he said, 9,000 years before his sources learned about it, a civilization called Atlantis. The warning given to Zusudra. Before examining the Greek account, we need to look more closely at what the Mesopotamian sources actually say about the flood's mechanism and the preparation for survival. Because these aren't vague statements, the waters came and then receded. They're procedural descriptions that sound less like mythology and more like documentation. The warning given to the flood hero, whether Zusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, comes consistently through indirect means. The god Enki or A cannot directly violate the divine council's decision to destroy humanity, so he speaks to the reed walls of the hero's house rather than to the hero himself. This detail appears across versions. It serves a theological purpose, maintaining the god's technical obedience to divine decree while allowing the warning to be transmitted. But it also serves as a narrative device that sounds like something a survivor might report. Hearing a voice in the night, unclear at first whether it's real or imagined, slowly recognizing it as genuine warning. The warning includes specific construction instructions. The boat must be large enough to house multiple decks and compartments. In the most detailed versions, the dimensions are approximately equal in length, width, and height, 20 cubits, roughly 100 feet in each direction. If we use the standard Mesopotamian cubit of about 18 in, this creates a cube or near-cube shape quite different from a conventional boat design. Modern naval architects have analyzed these dimensions. A cube-shaped vessel makes no sense for sailing or for normal maritime use. It would be unstable, difficult to steer, and vulnerable to capsizing. But for the specific purpose described, surviving a catastrophic flood where the entire surface becomes water, with no possibility of directional control or navigation, a cube has advantages. It maximizes internal volume relative to surface area. It's inherently stable in any orientation, able to right itself if flipped. It's designed not to go anywhere, but simply to float and preserve what's inside. The construction materials are specified gopher wood in some versions, probably cypress or cedar in the Mesopotamian context. The interior and exterior are to be sealed thoroughly with bitumen, the natural asphalt that seeps from the ground in Iraq. Bitumen was the standard waterproofing material in Mesopotamia, used for everything from basket sealing to building construction. The instruction to seal both inside and outside the boat ensures complete water protection. The compartmentalization is emphasized across versions. The interior isn't a single hold, but is divided into multiple chambers on multiple decks. This serves both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it separates different types of cargo, prevents movement and mixing during turbulent conditions, and creates watertight subdivisions that could preserve buoyancy even if some compartments breached. Symbolically, it mirrors the ordered structure of creation itself, maintaining categories and distinctions even within the chaos of total destruction. The loading of the boat includes specific categories: family, craftsmen, animals, both wild and domestic, seed of all living things, treasures, provisions. The inclusion of craftsmen is particularly noteworthy. These aren't just random survivors. They're specialists, people with technical knowledge in metalwork, construction, textile production, agriculture. The preservation concern isn't just biological, but technological. The boat carries not just genetic diversity, but cultural and practical knowledge necessary for rebuilding civilization. The animal loading doesn't specify two of every kind as in the biblical version, though some translations suggest pairs. The Adian phrasing in Atraces speaks of seed of all living things and wild beasts of the steppe. The emphasis seems to be on representative diversity rather than comprehensive completeness. The survivors need breeding populations to re-establish animal life, but the text doesn't claim every single species globally was gathered. This is a more pragmatic description than a miraculous one. The timing receives precise attention. Atrahasis is told to watch for a specific sign. When Shamash, the judge, will rain down upon you a rain of loaves at dusk. Enter the boat and close the door. This cryptic instruction might refer to atmospheric conditions before the storm, certain cloud formations at sunset perhaps, or volcanic ash beginning to fall. Whatever the specific meaning, it indicates that the flood wouldn't arrive without warning signs. Someone observing the sky and understanding the portent could know when to seal the boat. The storm itself is described with layers of detail that don't feel invented. The darkness comes first, not the storm, but darkness at the wrong time. Light turns to shadow, the horizon blackens. Then wind rises, gathering force, then rain, torrential beyond normal experience. Then what the texts describe as both water from above and water from below. Rain and flood together, suggesting not just precipitation, but widespread inundation from multiple sources. The underground waters breaking forth is a consistent element. The Akkadian term used is APPPs, the deep underground ocean in Mesopotamian cosmology. But Absu isn't purely mythological. It refers to groundwater and aquifers, the actual water sources that fed Mesopotamian cities through wells and springs. The description of Absu breaking forth suggests not just surface flooding, but the water table itself rising, springs overwhelming their channels, aquifers breaching to the surface. Modern geology recognizes this phenomenon. During massive precipitation events, especially in flat alluvial plains like Mesopotamia, groundwater can indeed rise rapidly and contribute to flooding from below, while rain floods from above. The combination creates water levels that can't be predicted from rainfall alone. This detail in the ancient texts suggests observational accuracy, not fantasy. The duration is consistent, 7 days and 7 nights. This might be stylized, 7 being a significant number in Mesopotamian numerology, but it might also represent genuine memory of an extended storm system. Modern hurricanes can stall over regions for days. Atmospheric rivers, the phenomenon where tropical moisture feeds continuous rainfall, can persist for a week or more. A 7-day catastrophic precipitation event is extreme, but not physically impossible. The description of the storm's effects includes details that sound like eyewitness observation. People unable to recognize each other, suggesting either darkness or possibly ash or dust in the air. Mountains submerged indicating waters rising well above normal floodplain levels, the sounds of destruction, the terror of those experiencing it, the isolation of those sealed in the boat unable to see or help others. Then comes the cessation. The texts don't describe a gradual tapering. They describe a sudden calming after the seventh day. The winds stop, the rain ends, light returns. This pattern, catastrophic storm followed by sudden calm matches. Certain meteorological phenomena, particularly the aftermath of supertorms, or the clearing that follows when a major weather system finally moves past a region. The boat grounds on a mountain. The texts name different mountains in different versions. Mount Nemosh in Gilgamesh elsewhere, Mount Ararat, or mountains in the Zagros range. This variation might reflect different cultural traditions or confusion about geography, but the consistency is that the boat comes to rest at elevation, not in the Mesopotamian plain where the cities were. The survivors have been carried far from their starting point by the floodwaters. The waiting period after grounding is detailed. The survivor doesn't immediately disembark. He waits 7 days in most versions, watching the waters recede. This is pragmatic. Even though the boat is grounded, the surrounding area might still be deeply flooded, uninhabitable, or unstable. The waiting period allows conditions to improve sufficiently for safe emergence. The bird sequence serves as reconnaissance. A dove is sent first. Doves are not strong flyers and would return quickly if conditions were unsuitable. It returns having found nowhere to land. This indicates water still covers most surfaces, at least within the dove's flight range. After more waiting, a swallow is sent. Swallows are more versatile, but also prefer to land. It also returns, suggesting conditions haven't improved enough yet. Finally, a raven is sent. Ravens are opportunistic feeders and strong flyers. The text specifies that the raven saw receding waters, found food, presumably floating carrying, and didn't return. The survivor interprets this correctly. The raven has found habitable conditions and doesn't need to return to the boat. Only then is it safe to disembark. This sequence isn't arbitrary. It's graduated testing, moving from most sensitive to conditions, dove to most adaptable, raven. It shows patience, observation, and practical decision-making under uncertain circumstances. These are the details someone who actually experienced such a situation might remember and transmit to descendants. We waited. We tested the conditions. We proceeded cautiously. The post-flood actions are also procedural. The survivor disembarks, releases the animals, and makes offerings to the gods. The sacrifice uses multiple types of wood and creates rising smoke. The gods, starving for sacrifices after humanity's destruction, gather around the smoke like flies. A remarkably unflattering but psychologically interesting image. It suggests the gods need humans as much as humans need gods. A theological sophistication that undercuts simple divine omnipotence. The granting of immortality to the survivor appears across versions. Zusudra is placed in Dilmun, the land where the sun rises. Atrahasis is given eternal life and relocated beyond normal geography. Utapishtim is made like the gods and placed at the mouth of the rivers. This detail, the survivor being removed from normal human life after the catastrophe, serves mythological purposes, explaining why these figures aren't still present. But it might also preserve a memory of geographical displacement. The survivors didn't return to where they started, but established themselves in new locations. The return of civilization after the flood is described not as new beginning, but as restoration. In the Sumerian king list, kingship was lowered from heaven again to specific cities. The repetition of again indicates continuity with pre-flood civilization. The cities rebuilt aren't experimental settlements, but re-established urban centers, implying that survivors carry forward knowledge of urban planning, architecture, agriculture, and administration. This is the pattern that makes these accounts potentially documentary rather than purely mythological. They preserve the kind of procedural and observational details that actual survivors would remember. How to build the vessel, what materials to use, when to seal the door, how long the storm lasted, how to test whether conditions had improved, what actions to take upon emerging. These aren't the details of allegory or moral teaching. They're the details of experience preserved and transmitted, because they were considered important knowledge about how the world once changed and how survival was possible. The question is whether these details describe a localized Mesopotamian flood, severe but regional, or whether they preserve fragmented memories of something global, something that would have affected not just the Tigris-Euphrates plain, but coastlines worldwide, something catastrophic enough to divide all subsequent history into before and after. To answer that question, we need to look beneath the cities themselves at what archaeology has found when excavators dug deep enough to reach the layers below Sumerian civilization. Mud beneath the cities. In 1922, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley began excavations at one of ancient Mesopotamia's most important cities. Appears in biblical tradition as the birthplace of Abraham, but its history extends back far earlier than any biblical timeline. Woolley's expedition, sponsored by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, would spend 12 years systematically excavating the site, revealing a sequence of occupation extending from approximately 5000 BCE through the early Christian era. During the 1928 to 1929 season, Woolley's team dug a deep shaft through the archaeological layers, reaching down through successively older strata. They passed through the Neo-Ablonian period, the Old Babylonian period, the early dynastic Sumerian levels. They reached the earliest occupation layer, showing monumental architecture and writing. Then they hit something unexpected. Thick deposit of clean water laid clay and silt, completely sterile of archaeological material. This wasn't unusual in itself. Mesopotamian cities often showed flood deposits. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, part of the natural cycle that made the region agriculturally productive, but this deposit was different. It was 8 ft thick in some areas, far thicker than normal flood deposits. And it was remarkably clean, showing characteristics of slow, sustained deposition rather than a single flood pulse. Woolley kept digging. Beneath the flood deposit, his team found earlier occupation layers, pottery, stone tools, remnants of structures. People had lived here before the flood. Then the flood had come, depositing 8 ft of sediment. Then, after an uncertain interval, new occupation began above the flood layer. The city rebuilt. Woolley initially interpreted this as evidence of the flood, the deluge described in Genesis and in the Sumerian texts. His announcement created international sensation. Newspapers proclaimed that Noah's flood had been archaeologically verified. But as more excavations proceeded, the picture became more complicated. Other expeditions found flood deposits at other Mesopotamian sites, but not all from the same time period. At Kish, archaeologist Stephen Langdon found a flood layer dating to approximately 2900 BCE. At Shurupak, as mentioned earlier, Robert Coldwee and later teams found flood deposits from the Gemdet Nasa period, roughly 2900 to 2600 BCE. At Uruk, flood evidence appeared, but from different stratigraphic contexts. The flood deposit at that Woolley had found dated to approximately 4500 BCE, CE significantly earlier than the deposits at other sites. This created a problem for any unified flood interpretation. If the deposits at different sites dated to different periods, they couldn't represent a single catastrophic event. They had to be separate floods, perhaps part of the regular, if occasionally severe flooding that characterizes the Mesopotamian plain. This became the mainstream archaeological interpretation. The flood deposits represented multiple localized flooding events over centuries, not a single global catastrophe. The Sumerian flood tradition preserved cultural memory of severe flooding in general, perhaps of one particularly devastating event, but nothing that approached the scale described in the tablets. This interpretation is reasonable and probably correct for the specific archaeological deposits, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the larger question because the flood deposits beneath the Sumerian cities date to periods well after the event described in the King list as dividing antediluvian from post-diluvian civilization. The Sumerian texts, don't claim the flood happened during the early dynastic period or during Jemdet Nasa. They place it in the deep past, before the beginning of the historically recoverable king lists, in a time the texts describe as fundamentally different from the post-flood world. If the Sumerian flood tradition preserves memory of an event from the end of the last ice age around 9600 BCE or earlier, then we wouldn't expect to find archaeological evidence at the level of Sumerian cities. We'd expect to find it much deeper at terminal Pliene or early Holy Sign levels, if at all. And indeed, such evidence would be difficult to identify, even if it existed, because sea levels during the Ice Age were 400 ft lower than today. Any coastal civilizations that existed before the Ice Age ended would now be submerged under hundreds of feet of water on what is now continental shelf. The Persian Gulf itself offers a striking example. During the last glacial maximum around 20,000 BCE, the Gulf didn't exist as we know it. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed south through what is now the Gulf floor, meeting the ocean at a coastline far to the southeast of the current Gulf mouth. This exposed basin was a river valley with freshwater flow, quite possibly fertile and habitable. As the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, water gradually filled this basin. By around 5000 BCE, the Persian Gulf had reached approximately its modern extent. But the flooding process wasn't gradual and steady. It included periods of rapid sea level rise, meltwater pulses when ice sheets collapsed catastrophically, raising global sea levels by several meters within decades or less. One of these events, Meltwater Pulse 1b, occurred around 9600 BCE, precisely when Plato's sources dated the destruction of Atlantis. During this event, sea levels rose by approximately 2 to 3 meters globally within a relatively short period, possibly as little as a century or two. For coastlines with shallow gradients like the Persian Gulf Basin or the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, this could mean the shoreline moving dozens of miles inland within a human lifetime. Archaeological evidence for human occupation on these now submerged lands is difficult to obtain, but not absent. Marine archaeology has found submerged settlement sites off multiple coastlines worldwide. In the Persian Gulf, diving surveys have located artifact scatters on the seafloor, suggesting pre-inundation occupation. Off the coasts of India, stone tools and structural remains have been found underwater. The Mediterranean has yielded submerged Neolithic sites. The North Sea has produced extensive evidence of Mesolithic occupation on what was dry land during the Ice Age. These discoveries confirm that people lived on lands now underwater. They lived on Ice Age coastlines that no longer exist. They hunted, gathered, possibly farmed, and certainly adapted to coastal environments that were subsequently drowned by rising seas. How sophisticated these coastal populations were remains uncertain because their settlements are now inaccessible for systematic excavation. But the absence of easily accessible evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's evidence that we're looking in the wrong places if we want to find remains from the terminal Pli. The cities that existed along Ice Age coastlines are now underwater, buried under meters of marine sediment, effectively invisible to conventional archaeology. The Sumerian cities we can excavate, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Shuruppak, are inland cities safe from sea level rise established after the great floods of the Younger Dryas termination. The flood deposits found beneath these cities are from later local events. But that doesn't mean the tradition of the flood is purely mythological. It means the event remembered in Sumerian tradition might have been so ancient that it predated the founding of the cities where the memory was eventually recorded. This temporal problem appears across flood traditions globally. The events described in flood myths are usually placed in a deep past before the foundation of current civilizations. This pattern makes sense if the floods being remembered actually occurred before the establishment of the societies doing the remembering. The myths aren't contemporary accounts. They're transmitted memories of earlier catastrophes that destroyed earlier populations. When Woolley and others found flood deposits at Mesopotamian sites, they were finding evidence that the region experienced severe flooding multiple times. This is important. It shows the Mesopotamian plain was vulnerable to catastrophic inundation. It demonstrates that the concern with flooding evident in Mesopotamian literature wasn't abstract, but grounded in repeated experience. But it doesn't prove or disprove that a much earlier, much larger flood occurred during the transition out of the Ice Age. To evaluate that possibility, we need to look at evidence from outside Mesopotamia. We need to examine whether other cultures in other regions preserved similar traditions. And we need to look at one tradition in particular, one that provides a specific date for when the catastrophe occurred, one that describes the destruction in terms matching the Sumerian accounts, and one that adds an element the Mesopotamian texts don't emphasize the name of the civilization that was destroyed. This tradition comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, describing what Egyptian priests told an Athenian lawmaker named Solon more than 200 years earlier. The priests spoke of an island empire destroyed by earthquake and flood, an advanced civilization lost in a single day and night of catastrophe. They said it happened 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it around 9600 BCE, precisely at the boundary between the Younger Dryas and the Holy Sign, precisely when meltwater pulse 1b caused rapid global sea level rise, and precisely within the time frame when the Sumerian texts placed the great flood that divided their history. The destroyed civilization, according to Plato's account, was called Atlantis when kingship descended again. Before we turn to the Greek account, we need to examine one more element from the Sumerian sources that has profound implications for how we understand their flood tradition. This is the structure of the Sumerian king list itself, and what it reveals about how the Sumerians conceptualized time, history, and the relationship between the world before the flood and the world after. The Weld-Blundell prism, our most complete copy of the king list, divides history into two distinct eras with a single line. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. That word again is crucial. Kingship doesn't begin after the flood. It resumes. It's lowered from heaven a second time, implying it had been lowered once before during the antediluvian period. This suggests continuity of concept, if not continuity of political structure. The institution of kingship, the idea of divinely sanctioned rulership over urban populations, existed before the flood and was reconstituted after. The form might have changed, but the underlying principle remained. This is not how we typically think about catastrophic destruction myths. Usually such myths describe total rupture. Everything before is gone. Everything after is new creation. The Sumerian account describes rupture followed by restoration. The antediluvian section of the king list names 8 kings across 5 cities. The reign lengths are impossibly long: 28,800 years for Aluluim of Eruidu, 36,000 years for his successor Alalgar, continuing through 43,200 years for Enmanlu, and now of Bad Tabira, concluding with 36,000 years for Ubara Tutu of Shurupak, father of Judra, the flood hero. The total comes to 2,400 years of antediluvian kingship. These numbers are clearly not literal historical records. No human lives tens of thousands of years. Various interpretations have been proposed. The numbers represent months rather than years. Reducing the scale significantly, the numbers are astronomical cycles encoded numerically. The numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. The numbers are entirely symbolic, expressing the sacred antiquity of pre-flood civilization without historical intent. What matters for our investigation isn't resolving which interpretation is correct. What matters is recognizing what the structure of the list reveals about Sumerian historical consciousness. They divided time into before and after a catastrophic boundary. They considered the before time to be vastly different from the after time reflected in the impossible to fathom reign lengths. But they also considered the before time to be real, to contain actual cities and actual rulers whose names and sequence they preserved. The 5 antediluvian cities appear consistently across multiple versions of Sumerian king lists and flood narratives. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Tsipar, and Shurupak. These aren't random selections. They're a specific stable tradition. And critically, most of these cities have been archaeologically identified and excavated. They're real places with real occupation histories extending back into the Ubaid period around 5000 BCE. Eridu, consistently named as the first city, holds particular importance. Excavations by Satan Lloyd and Fuad Sapar in the 1940s revealed a remarkable sequence of 18 temple platforms, each built atop the ruins of its predecessor, extending back to approximately 5000 BCE. The temples were dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the god who warned the flood hero and preserved humanity. The consistency of dedication across thousands of years shows that Eridu's sacred character wasn't invented late, but was fundamental to its identity from the earliest period we can trace. Why would Eridu be remembered as the first city? Because by the time Sumerians began writing history, Eridu was already ancient beyond easy recollection. Its foundation lay buried beneath layers of successive reconstructions. When scribes compiled the king list around 2100 BCE, Eridu's temple sequence already extended back more than 3,000 years. It was old beyond living memory, old beyond genealogical reckoning, old enough to be considered primordial. But here's the intriguing detail. Even at the level of Eridu's earliest excavated layers around 5000 BCE, we don't find the beginnings of architecture or urban planning. We find sophisticated temple construction from the start. The earliest level, Temple 1, shows knowledge of brickmaking, architectural planning, and sacred space organization. The people who built it weren't inventing these concepts. They were applying them. This pattern appears across early Mesopotamian sites. The settlements we can excavate from the Ubaid period 6500–3800 BCE CE show up already possessing complex social organization, sophisticated material culture, and advanced agricultural systems. The developmental stages must exist somewhere earlier, but they're not easily visible in the archaeological record. The Sumerian explanation for this apparent sudden complexity was that knowledge came from before, from survivors of the flood, who carried forward what was known in the antediluvian cities. This isn't necessarily factual history, but it reveals how the Sumerians themselves understood their cultural origins. They didn't see themselves as primitives gradually inventing civilization through trial and error. They saw themselves as inheritors and restorers of knowledge that had nearly been lost. This conception appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature. The divine principles governing all aspects of civilization were said to have existed from the beginning, to have been preserved by the gods during the flood, and to have been bestowed on cities as gifts, rather than developed by human ingenuity. The included writing, kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, sexual intercourse, music, law, judgment, art, and dozens of other civilizational elements. They were treated not as human inventions, but as fundamental aspects of cosmic order that humans accessed rather than created. This worldview differs fundamentally from modern progressive narratives of civilization. We assume each development, agriculture, architecture, writing, mathematics, law emerged through gradual innovation, with simpler forms preceding complex ones. The Sumerian view was that complexity existed first carried forward from the antediluvian world, and what we see in the historical record is recovery and restoration rather than invention and progress. Which interpretation is correct? The question might be unanswerable with current evidence, but it's worth noting that the pattern of sudden complexity appears worldwide at the beginning of the Holene period. Between approximately 9600 BCE and 30,000 BCE, human societies across multiple continents independently transitioned from mobile hunter-gatherer groups to sedentary agricultural communities to urban civilization. This transition is called the Neolithic Revolution, and its apparent rapidity and global scope have puzzled archaeologists for decades. Standard explanation attributes this to climate change. The end of the Younger Dryas brought stable, warm conditions favorable for agriculture. Populations that have been forced into marginal territories during the cold period could now expand and experiment with plant cultivation. With reliable food supplies, populations grew, enabling specialization and social complexity. Cities emerged naturally from these processes. This explanation is probably correct at the mechanical level, but it doesn't fully account for the speed of transition or the sophistication of early urban centers. Take Göbekli in southern Turkey, a massive stone temple complex dating to approximately 9500 BCE. Right at the Younger Dryas boundary, the site consists of carved megalithic pillars arranged in circular enclosures decorated with relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. It required coordinated labor, sophisticated stonework knowledge, and some form of social organization capable of mobilizing and sustaining a workforce. Göbekli was built by people conventionally classified as hunter-gatherers before the development of agriculture in the region. Yet it demonstrates capabilities usually associated with much later civilization. The standard interpretation is that we've underestimated hunter-gatherer societies' organizational capacities. The alternative interpretation which the Sumerian sources might support is that the builders of Göbekli weren't inventing these capabilities, but were among the survivors of the cataclysm that ended the Younger Dryas carrying forward knowledge from whatever came before. The Sumerian phrase "when kingship was lowered from heaven again" might be more than mythological poetry. It might reflect genuine cultural memory of a time when social organization had to be reconstituted after disruption. Survivors of the flood, scattered and reduced in number, gradually re-establishing urban centers in regions that had become habitable again after the catastrophe. The knowledge existed. Architecture, agriculture, social hierarchy, but the population and infrastructure had to be rebuilt. The post-flood section of the King List moves into what scholars consider semi-historical territory. The early post-flood dynasties, the first dynasty of Kish, the first dynasty of Uruk, still show inflated reign lengths, but not impossibly so. Rulers reigned for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. Lengths that might represent either dynasties compressed into single names or may reflect different calendar systems. But by the time we reach the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE, the King List is naming rulers who appear in other contemporary sources, whose architectural works have been excavated, whose historical reality is not in serious doubt. This transition from impossible to inflated to plausible reign lengths suggests the King List represents multiple layers of tradition. The deepest layer, the antediluvian section, is purely legendary, preserved through oral tradition for unknown centuries before being written down. The next layer, early post-flood dynasties, is semi-legendary, mixing authentic genealogical memory with mythological enhancement. The most recent layers are increasingly reliable historical records. But legendary doesn't mean invented. Legendary can mean ancient, transmitted through so many generations that original context is lost, but core narrative remains. The Iliad was considered legendary until Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy and demonstrated that the legendary city was a real place. The Saris of Iceland were considered fanciful until archaeological excavation confirmed details about settlements, trade routes, and even specific buildings described in the texts. The Sumerian flood tradition has the characteristics of legitimate cultural memory overlaid with theological interpretation. The cities mentioned are real. The concern with flooding is grounded in environmental reality. The division of history into before and after reflects a genuine sense of temporal rupture. The specific details preserved. Boat dimensions, storm duration, procedural elements don't serve obvious mythological functions, but do serve mnemonic functions, helping transmission of a complex narrative across generations. What the King List tells us is that the Sumerians believed their civilization had a history extending back before the foundation of their earliest cities. They believed that history included a catastrophic boundary that destroyed most of what came before. They believed survivors carried forward knowledge that allowed civilization to be restored rather than reinvented. And they considered this not minor myth, but fundamental history, important enough to preserve in multiple copies, to include in royal inscriptions, to teach to scribal students across centuries. This is the context we need to keep in mind as we turn to examine the Greek account, because Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, describes a civilization destroyed by catastrophic flood. He dates this destruction to approximately 9600 BCE. He describes advanced urban culture, lost suddenly and completely, with only fragmented memory surviving. He presents this not as Greek invention, but as information preserved by Egyptian priests, transmitted to Greek sources, and recorded because it seemed important and possibly true. The parallels between the Sumerian and Greek accounts aren't exact, but they're substantial, and they both might be preserving fragments of the same lost history. History of what happened when the last ice age ended, when sea levels rose dramatically, when coastlines worldwide were inundated, and when whatever human societies existed along those vanished shorelines were destroyed. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Sumerians called it the antediluvian world. The geological record calls it the Younger Dews termination and meltwater pulse 1b. They might all be describing the same event viewed through different cultural lenses preserved through different transmission chains, but pointing toward the same historical reality. An Athenian in Egypt around 590 BCE. An Athenian statesman named Solon visited Egypt. This trip is well documented historically. Solon was one of Athens's most important early leaders, a lawgiver who reformed the city's legal and political systems, and is often considered one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. After completing his reforms, Solon left Athens for 10 years, partly to allow his legal changes to take effect without his interference, and partly to travel and gather knowledge. Egypt fascinated Greek intellectuals. It was ancient beyond Greek reckoning, possessed monumental architecture that dwarfed anything in Greece, maintained written records extending back thousands of years, and preserved priestly knowledge that the Greeks respected even if they didn't fully understand it. For someone like Solon, interested in law, governance, and the long patterns of human civilization, Egypt offered unparalleled resources. During his visit, Solon spent time in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, a major religious and political center. There he conversed with Egyptian priests discussing history, philosophy, and the antiquity of civilizations. According to Plato, writing more than 200 years later in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, these conversations included the priest's account of an ancient war between Athens and a powerful empire called Atlantis. We need to be careful here. Plato is our only source for this story. No Egyptian text describing Atlantis have been found. No other Greek author mentions Solon learning about Atlantis, though several writers mention his Egyptian trip. The story comes to us filtered through Plato's philosophical agenda. He was using the Atlantis narrative as a political allegory about ideal and corrupted states. Mainstream scholarship considers Atlantis purely fictional, a philosophical thought experiment Plato invented to illustrate his ideas about governance, hubris, and divine justice. This interpretation is reasonable and probably correct at one level. Plato was writing philosophy, not history. He used myths, allegories, and invented narratives to make philosophical points throughout his work. But there's a subtle question worth considering. Where did Plato get the specific details of his story? If he invented it completely, why set it 9,000 years in the past, rather than in mythological time outside normal chronology? Why provide specific geographical details, architectural descriptions, and historical mechanisms for the civilization's destruction? Why frame it as information from Egyptian sources rather than as Greek myth or purely philosophical speculation? One possibility is that Plato built his allegory around a genuine tradition, something Solon actually did here in Egypt, which Plato then elaborated for philosophical purposes. The core narrative might have historical roots, even if Plato's specific telling serves fictional purposes. This is the possibility we need to examine because if there's a historical kernel within Plato's account, it might correspond to what the Sumerian sources describe. Here's what Plato's Egyptian priests tell Solomon, as Plato recounts it in Timaeus. Egypt's records, the priests say, extend far deeper into the past than Greek memory. The Greeks are like children, they tell Solon, always beginning anew, never maintaining knowledge across catastrophes. This is because Greece experiences periodic destructions, floods, droughts, fires that kill the educated classes and obliterate written records, forcing each generation to rebuild knowledge from near zero. Egypt, protected by the Nile's annual floods and by its geographical isolation, has maintained continuous records where Greece has not. The priests have access to documents describing events that Greeks have forgotten or never knew occurred. One such event, they tell Solon, was a war that occurred 9,000 years before their conversation, approximately 9600 BCE, by our calendar. At that time, a powerful empire existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, ruling an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. This empire, called Atlantis, controlled additional territories across the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. Atlantis was rich, technologically advanced, and militarily powerful. Its central island contained elaborate architecture, including a royal palace, vast harbor works, temple complexes, and a unique concentric pattern of alternating water and land rings surrounding the capital. The Atlanteans possessed metallurgy, sophisticated agriculture, extensive maritime capabilities, and social organization on an imperial scale. Then, according to the priests, Atlantis became corrupt. Hubris overtook the rulers. The divine aspect of their nature was diluted by increasing mortal character. They decided to conquer the Mediterranean world, attacking Egypt and Athens. Somehow, impossibly, the Athenians, whose city in this deep past bore no resemblance to the Athens Solon knew, defeated the Atlantean invasion. But victory was followed immediately by catastrophe. Afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impossible and uncarchable, being blocked up by the Shaw mud which the island created as it settled down. This is the account as Plato presents it. Much of it is clearly problematic from a historical standpoint. An Athenian civilization in 9600 BCE is archaeologically impossible. The site of Athens shows no occupation that early. An island empire larger than Libya and Asia combined has no known geological basis. The specific architectural details Plato provides in his longer treatment in Critias read more like idealized city planning than historical description. But let's set aside what's clearly Plato's elaboration and focus on the chronological and catastrophic elements, because these are where the connection to other sources becomes intriguing. The date 9,000 years before Solon's time puts the destruction around 9600 BCE. This is precisely the boundary between the younger Dryas and the Holy Sign, the moment when the last ice age ended and the modern warm period began. It's when meltwater pulse 1b caused rapid sea level rise. It's when dramatic climate change reshaped the global environment. It's when geological records show one of the most abrupt transitions in Earth's recent history. The mechanism: violent earthquakes and floods occurring simultaneously, causing an island to sink and vanish in a single day and night. This matches what would happen if a coastal region was struck by massive seismic activity, accompanied by tsunami and rapid sea level rise. The compression of events into a single day and night might be narrative convention rather than literal timing, but it conveys sudden catastrophic destruction. The aftermath, the sea in that region becoming impassable and uncarchable, being blocked up by the Shaw mud, which the island created as it settled down. This is a strange detail to include if you're inventing a story. It serves no obvious philosophical purpose, but it does match what actually happens when land subsides beneath the sea. It creates shallow, sediment-filled waters that are navigationally treacherous. The framing the story comes not from Greek tradition, but from Egyptian records. Egypt's claim to have memory extending far beyond Greek recollection is historically accurate. Egyptian civilization was already ancient when Greek civilization began. If anyone in the Mediterranean world circa 600 BCE had records or traditions extending back to the end of the Ice Age, it would be Egypt. The connection to floods. Plato's Egyptian priests explicitly compare Atlantis' destruction to other catastrophic floods that have repeatedly destroyed civilizations. They tell Solon that the Greeks have experienced multiple catastrophes that wiped out their written culture, forcing them to start over. This matches the pattern we see in the Sumerian sources, awareness of multiple catastrophes, with one particularly significant flood serving as a historical divider. Could Plato have invented all these correspondences accidentally? Possibly. The 9,000-year date might be arbitrary or might be chosen for symbolic numerological reasons. 9,000 is a round number divisible by many factors meaningful in Greek mathematics. The earthquake and flood mechanism might be drawn from Greek experience with tsunamis and seismic events. The Egyptian framing might be a literary device to lend exotic authority to his narrative. But there's another possibility. Plato might have been working from something genuinely old. Not necessarily a detailed Egyptian historical document about Atlantis specifically, but perhaps a tradition preserved in Egypt about catastrophic floods at the end of the Ice Age, about lands that were submerged, about civilizations that existed before the current world order. Plato might have taken this fragmentary tradition and elaborated it into a detailed narrative that served his philosophical purposes while maintaining some connection to the original source material. This interpretation would explain some of the oddities in Plato's account. It would explain why he dates the event so precisely and so far back. It would explain why he attributes the story to Egypt rather than claiming Greek origin. It would explain why he includes peculiar details, like the navigational difficulties after the island sank. Details that don't serve his philosophical agenda, but might be remnants of the original tradition. And crucially, this interpretation would mean that Greek and Mesopotamian sources were preserving memories of the same event. The Sumerian tablets describe a catastrophic flood that destroyed antediluvian civilization, with survivors preserving knowledge that allowed rebuilding. Plato's account describes a catastrophic flood that destroyed an advanced island civilization at precisely the moment geological records show the Ice Age ended with dramatic sea level rise. The destroyed civilization has different names in different traditions. Atlantis in Greek, the antediluvian world in Sumerian, perhaps other names in other cultures. The geographical details differ. Sumerians focus on Mesopotamian cities. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But the chronology, the catastrophic mechanism, and the theme of advanced civilization, destroyed by sudden inundation, align across these otherwise independent sources. Neither source proves the other. Both might be purely mythological despite their correspondences, but the pattern of agreement is suggestive. Two different cultural traditions arising independently thousands of miles apart describe civilization destroying floods. One provides remarkable procedural detail preserved across multiple ancient texts. The other provides a specific date that aligns perfectly with geological evidence for global catastrophe. Both frame their accounts as preservation of ancient knowledge rather than as contemporary invention. What we need to examine next is whether that geological evidence actually supports the possibility of a global catastrophe, severe enough to destroy coastal civilizations and be remembered for thousands of years afterward. A civilization lost to rising waters. The dialogue gives only a brief outline of the Atlantis story. Plato's other work, Critias, provides much more detail, though the text breaks off incomplete. In Critias, Plato describes Atlantis's geography, architecture, resources, political organization, and eventual corruption with remarkable specificity. Much of this is clearly idealized philosophical invention. The mathematical precision of the island's layout, the perfect alternation of land and water rings, the detailed constitutional arrangements. But embedded within Plato's philosophical construction are descriptions that sound oddly observational, details that don't obviously serve allegorical purposes. It's worth examining these to see whether they might preserve fragments of genuine tradition alongside Plato's elaborations. The island of Atlantis, Plato says, was given by the gods to Poseidon. At its center was a hill where a mortal woman named Cleito lived. Poseidon broke the ground around this hill into alternating rings of land and water, 2 rings of land and 3 of water, circular, perfectly concentric, isolating the central hill. This became the palace district, expanded over generations into an elaborate capital. The outermost ring of water formed a harbor. A canal connected this harbor to the sea, wide enough to admit the largest ships. The rings themselves could be traversed by bridges at key points, allowing movement from outer to inner zones. The innermost ring, the original hill, held the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, containing a massive gold statue of the god standing in a chariot pulled by winged horses. The island beyond the capital was fertile, supporting extensive agriculture. Mountains protected the northern regions. The plain south of the mountains was enormous, flat, irrigated by canals, capable of producing multiple harvests. Resources included valuable metals, particularly a metal Plato calls orolum, described as glowing like fire, second in value only to gold. The political structure was a confederation of 10 kingdoms, each ruling part of the island or surrounding territories. The kings met periodically at the central temple to adjudicate disputes and make collective decisions. Laws were inscribed on a pillar of orculum in the temple. Rituals involved the sacrifice of bulls with the blood used in oath-taking ceremony. For many generations, Plato says the Atlanteans maintained virtue. They possessed wealth and power, but used them with wisdom. They valued character over material gain. They maintained just governance and treated subject populations fairly, but gradually across generations the divine nature in them was diluted by mortal inheritance. They became ambitious, acquisitive, morally corrupt. They decided to conquer the known world. Their military expeditions succeeded initially. They conquered territories across the Mediterranean and advanced on Egypt and Athens. But the Athenians rallied and somehow defeated them, liberating enslaved peoples. Then came divine judgment. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods. And in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men inner body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. This is where Critias breaks off. Incomplete. Plato never describes the catastrophe in detail, never explains how the island sank, never addresses what happened to the Atlanteans who weren't on military campaigns. The abrupt ending has frustrated readers for 2,400 years. How do we assess this account? Most of it is clearly Plato's invention, the perfect geometric layout, the constitutional details that mirror Plato's political philosophy, the moral arc from virtue to corruption that serves his didactic purposes. But some elements don't fit neatly into philosophical allegory, the canal system, for instance. Plato describes an extensive network of irrigation canals making the agricultural plain exceptionally productive. This is practical infrastructure, not symbolic. Such canal systems existed in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, demonstrating that ancient societies could engineer complex irrigation. But why include this detail if Atlantis is purely allegorical? It doesn't advance Plato's philosophical points about justice or political organization. The metals are interesting. Orichalcum isn't clearly identifiable with any known metal. Speculation ranges from brass to platinum to amber. But the emphasis on metallurgy, on mining, on working precious and utilitarian metals suggests a society with advanced materials technology. This matches what we know about Bronze Age civilizations, but extends it backward to a supposedly much earlier period. The harbor works, and maritime capabilities stand out. Plato describes Atlantis as a naval power, with fleets capable of crossing the Atlantic and Mediterranean. For a Bronze Age society, this would be remarkable, but not impossible. Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa. Minoans established far-flung trade networks, but placing such maritime capability at 9600 BCE, before any conventionally recognized civilization existed, seems anachronistic, unless it isn't anachronistic. Unless maritime capability developed earlier than we conventionally recognize and was lost during the catastrophic transition at the end of the Ice Age. This would require rethinking standard archaeological chronologies. But it's not physically impossible. Humans had cognitive capacity for complex technology by the late Ple. What they lacked was climate stability and population density. The catastrophic destruction is described in terms matching tsunami and earthquake. A single day and night of earthquakes and floods with an island sinking beneath the sea and making the waters navigationally treacherous afterward. This matches what would happen if a coastal region was struck by major seismic activity during a period of rapid sea level rise. The geological record confirms that the period around 9600 BCE was indeed catastrophic. The Younger Dry Cold period ended abruptly, possibly within just a few years. Temperatures rose dramatically. Ice sheets collapsed. Meltwater Pulse 1b raised sea levels by 2 to 3 m globally within a century or two, possibly much faster. Coastlines worldwide were inundated. For low-lying coastal regions, this would have been devastating. The Persian Gulf basin was flooded. The Black Sea experienced a massive inundation when Mediterranean waters broke through what is now the Bosporus. The North Sea expanded dramatically, flooding lands that connected Britain to continental Europe. Southeast Asia lost enormous territories as the Sun Shelf was submerged. The Mediterranean saw its coastlines retreat inland. Any coastal civilization existing at this time would have experienced catastrophe. Not metaphorical catastrophe, but literal destruction of settlements, loss of agricultural lands, forced migration inland, and collapse of whatever social structures had developed. The catastrophe would have been sudden from a human perspective. Within lifetimes, the world transformed. This is the context in which we need to evaluate Plato's account. Not whether there was literally an island called Atlantis with concentric water rings and a temple containing a gold statue of Poseidon, but whether there were coastal civilizations around 9600 BCE that were destroyed by the combination of seismic activity, tsunami, and rapid sea level rise that geological evidence shows occurred at precisely that moment. If such civilizations existed, they would now be underwater. Their settlements would be buried under marine sediment on continental shelves. Their populations would have been either destroyed or forced to migrate inland to higher ground. Their knowledge and culture would have been disrupted, preserved only fragmentarily by survivors who eventually contributed to the societies that emerged in the early Holy. This scenario matches what the Sumerian sources describe: an antediluvian civilization destroyed by catastrophic flood with survivors carrying forward knowledge that allowed restoration of complex society. It matches what Plato describes: an advanced civilization destroyed by sudden catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, with only fragmentary memory surviving in Egyptian tradition. It doesn't prove that either source is historically accurate in detail, but it suggests that both might be preserving cultural memories of the same real event, filtered through different traditions, elaborated with different cultural specifics, but pointing toward the same historical phenomenon. The destruction of whatever human societies existed along Ice Age coastlines when the sea rose rapidly at the Younger Dryas termination. To evaluate this possibility further, we need to examine the geological record more carefully. What exactly happened at the end of the Younger Dryas? How rapid and severe was the environmental change? Could it have been catastrophic enough to destroy civilizations and be remembered for 9,000 years? The boundary between ice and Thor. The Younger Dryas gets its name from a wildflower Dryas octopala that thrives in cold climates. When European scientists analyzing pollen preserved in peat bogs noticed an unexpected return of driest pollen in layers dating to approximately 10,089 BCE, they realized something remarkable had happened. After the Ice Age had begun ending, after temperatures had started rising and ice sheets had begun retreating, the climate suddenly reversed. For more than 1,000 years, Ice Age conditions returned. Then just as suddenly, the cold ended, and the modern warm period began. This pattern appears globally in climate records. Ice cores from Greenland show the Younger Dryas as a distinct band of colder ice chemistry. Ocean sediment cores show changes in foraminifera populations, indicating colder water temperatures. Lake sediments show vegetation changes matching cold climate species. The evidence is unambiguous. Something caused the global climate to plunge back into Ice Age conditions after it had begun warming, then to snap out of those conditions abruptly. What caused the Younger Dryas remains debated. The leading hypothesis involves changes in ocean circulation. As the North American ice sheet melted, enormous quantities of fresh water flowed into the North Atlantic. This meltwater was less dense than salt water, so it floated on the ocean surface and disrupted the normal pattern of ocean currents. The Gulf Stream, which carries warm water northward and keeps European climates moderate, was weakened or redirected. Without this heat transport, the North Atlantic region and areas downwind experienced severe cooling. An alternative hypothesis, more controversial but gaining some scientific support, proposes that a comet or asteroid impact around 10,800 BCE triggered the Younger Dryas. This impact would have caused immediate environmental catastrophe, wildfires, atmospheric dust, disruption of climate patterns, and could explain the abrupt onset of the cold period. Evidence cited includes a layer of platinum enrichment in ice cores at the Younger Dryas boundary, magnetic particles that might be impact-generated, and black mats, dark organic rich layers in sediment associated with biomass burning at sites across North America. For our purposes, what caused the Younger Dryas matters less than what ended it, because the termination of the Younger Dryas was even more abrupt and dramatic than its onset. Climate records show that temperatures in Greenland rose by approximately 10 geese C within just a few decades, possibly as little as 10 years. This is extraordinarily rapid change. Modern climate change, concerning as it is, occurs at a much slower pace than what happened at the Younger Dryas termination. The warming triggered massive ice sheet collapse. The North American ice sheet, which had covered much of Canada and the northern United States, began disintegrating rapidly. The Fennoscandian ice sheet in northern Europe broke up. Ice shelves surrounding Antarctica experienced major carving events. Enormous quantities of frozen water converted to liquid and flowed into the ocean. Sea level rise during the deglaciation wasn't smooth and steady. It occurred in pulses, periods of relative stability interrupted by episodes of rapid rise. 3 major meltwater pulses have been identified in sea level records. Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred around 14,600 years ago, raising seas by approximately 20 meters over several centuries. Meltwater Pulse 1B occurred around 11,500 years ago at the Younger Dryas termination, raising seas by 2 to 3 meter. Meltwater Pulse 1C occurred around 8,200 years ago, with more modest sea level rise. Meltwater Pulse 1B, coinciding almost exactly with Plato's date for Atlantis' destruction, would have been catastrophic for coastal populations. A 2-3 meter sea level rise might not sound dramatic, but for low-gradient coastlines, it translates to shorelines moving inland by kilometers or tens of km. The Persian Gulf, which was largely dry land during the Ice Age, would have experienced flooding as the rising Indian Ocean water broke through and filled the basin. The sun shelf connecting Southeast Asian islands would have been inundated, transforming a continuous landmass into an archipelago. The Black Sea, if it hadn't already been connected to the Mediterranean, would have experienced catastrophic flooding as Mediterranean waters broke through. The flooding wouldn't have been a single wave. It would have been a process, rapid by geological standards, but extended over years or decades from a human perspective. Each storm surge would bring waters slightly further inland. Each annual high tide would exceed the previous years. Coastal settlements would face a choice: constantly relocate inland or build flood defenses and hope the rise stopped. For a society with limited technological capacity and no understanding of global sea level dynamics, the experience would be apocalyptic. The ocean advancing relentlessly. lands where generations had lived, becoming salt marsh, then shallow sea. No explanation available except that the gods had decided to destroy the world with water. This matches the description in both Plato's account and the Sumerian flood narratives. Waters rising, overwhelming the land, destroying what existed before. The time scale is longer than a single day and night, but cultural memory compresses events. A catastrophe unfolding over decades gets remembered as sudden. The precise duration matters less than the totality of destruction. The geological record also shows evidence of catastrophic flooding events beyond just sea level rise. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman suggests that around 5600 BCE, somewhat later than the Younger Dryas termination, but still within the general period of post-Ice Age adjustment, the Mediterranean Sea broke through the Bosphorus and catastrophically flooded the Black Sea basin. The Black Sea had been a freshwater lake at a lower elevation than the Mediterranean. When the rising Mediterranean reached the threshold, water poured through with the force of hundreds of Niagara Falls, raising the Black Sea level by meters and flooding enormous territories around its margins. This hypothesis remains debated, with some evidence supporting and some contradicting it. But whether the Black Sea deluge occurred exactly as proposed or not, it represents the kind of catastrophic flooding that geological processes can generate. And if it happened once, similar events likely happened elsewhere during the chaotic period when Ice Age geography transformed into modern geography. The Persian Gulf offers perhaps the most intriguing parallel to the Atlantis story. During the Ice Age, the Gulf didn't exist. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed through a broad valley where the Gulf now lies, meeting the ocean far to the southeast. This valley was potentially habitable freshwater river, relatively moderate climate, possible game animals, and plant resources. If humans occupied this region, their settlements are now 40-50 meters underwater. Marine archaeology surveys in the Persian Gulf have found evidence suggesting submerged human occupation. In 2015, divers located stone tools and structures on the sea floor in areas that would have been dry land 12,000 years ago. The evidence remains preliminary. Marine excavation is difficult and expensive, but it suggests humans did occupy the now submerged lands. As sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, the Persian Gulf basin filled gradually at first, then more rapidly during meltwater pulses. By around 6000 BCE, the Gulf had reached approximately its modern extent. Any populations occupying the valley would have been forced progressively inland over thousands of years, watching their world gradually drown. This is the process that might underlie both the Sumerian and Greek flood traditions. Not a single catastrophic event on a single day, but a long catastrophe unfolding across millennia as the Ice Age world transformed. For populations experiencing this transformation, it would have been the defining reality of existence. Each generation would see the waters further inland than their grandparents remembered. Eventually, everything would be underwater, and only the memory would remain. But there's another element we need to consider: the possibility that in addition to gradual sea level rise, there were acute catastrophic events, tsunamis generated by undersea earthquakes, undersea landslides, or glacial lake outburst floods. These would have created sudden, devastating waves that could destroy coastal settlements within hours. The Mediterranean, tectonically active and prone to earthquakes, would have experienced major tsunamis during the period of Ice Age termination. As ice sheets melted and weight redistributed across Earth's crust, isoadic rebound, the rising of land masses previously compressed by ice, would have triggered increased seismic activity. This is documented in geological records. Earthquake frequency and magnitude increased during deglaciation periods. A major earthquake-generated tsunami hitting a Mediterranean coastal settlement around 9600 BCE would match Plato's description precisely. Earthquake and flood arriving together, destroying in a day and night what had taken generations to build. The fact that this occurred during a period of general sea level rise would make the destruction permanent. The tsunami would destroy the settlement, and rising seas would ensure it was never reoccupied, eventually submerging it completely. This scenario reconciles the seemingly contradictory timeframes. The geological process sea level rise over centuries provides the context. The acute event tsunami and earthquake provides the catastrophic moment that would be remembered as the flood. Both are real. Both contributed to the destruction of Ice Age coastal societies, and both would be preserved in cultural memory, compressed and simplified, but retaining core accuracy. The question isn't whether catastrophic environmental change occurred at the younger destination. Geological evidence makes that indisputable. The question is whether human societies sophisticated enough to merit being called civilizations existed in the affected regions and were destroyed by these changes. Standard archaeological chronology says no. At 9600 BCE, humans were hunter-gatherers living in small mobile groups, not settled agricultural civilizations. The earliest known cities don't appear until after 7000 BCE CE in Anatolia, after 6000 BCE. In Mesopotamia, after 3000 BCE, in most other regions. Writing doesn't emerge until around 3400 BCE. Civilization by conventional definition is a post-Ice Age phenomenon. But this chronology is based on discovered sites. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. If Ice Age civilizations existed, we'd expect them to be in coastal locations near water, in moderate climates with access to marine resources. Those locations are now underwater. The fact that we haven't found extensive evidence of Ice Age civilization might simply mean we haven't looked in the right places, specifically on the continental shelves now covered by hundreds of feet of ocean. What the Sumerian and Greek sources might be preserving is memory of these lost coastal societies. Not necessarily civilizations equivalent to Bronze Age states, but perhaps more advanced than the hunter-gatherer stereotype suggests. Societies with permanent settlements, with some form of agriculture or sophisticated resource management, with specialized crafts and social hierarchies. Societies that were destroyed when the Ice Age ended and that were remembered by survivors who eventually contributed to the cultures we can document archaeologically. This interpretation remains speculative, but it's consistent with both the textual sources and the geological evidence, and it would explain why flood traditions appear so consistently across ancient cultures. Because the flood was real, was global, was catastrophic, and was preserved in cultural memory for thousands of years. To complete this investigation, we need to examine one more element: how such ancient memories could be preserved across such enormous time spans, and whether the mechanisms of cultural transmission make this scenario plausible. The Mediterranean's Bronze Age silence. Before addressing how catastrophic memories can be preserved across millennia, it's worth examining a comparative case. Another civilization-ending catastrophe that occurred within historical time, and that was remembered and documented. This is the Bronze Age collapse. The period around 1200–1100 BCE, when multiple advanced civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously failed. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 BCE. CE was a period of remarkable interconnection and prosperity. Egypt's new kingdom was at its height. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia. The Mycenaean civilization flourished in Greece. Minoan culture still thrived on Crete. City-states in the Levant engaged in extensive trade. These societies corresponded with each other, traded goods across vast distances, shared technologies, and maintained diplomatic relationships documented in archives like the Amarna letters. Then, within less than a century, this entire interconnected system collapsed. The Hittite capital Hattusa was destroyed and abandoned. Mason palaces across Greece were burned. Cities throughout the Levant and Anatolia were sacked. Egyptian records describe attacks by mysterious sea peoples whose exact identity remains unclear. Trade networks broke down. Writing disappeared in Greece, not to re-emerge for centuries. Population levels dropped dramatically. The archaeological evidence is striking. Excavations at sites across the region show destruction layers dated to approximately 1020 UO 150 BCE. The destructions often show evidence of fire and violent attack, though some sites seem to have been abandoned rather than destroyed. After the destruction, many sites show either complete abandonment or much reduced occupation at a significantly lower level of sophistication. What caused the Bronze Age collapse remains debated. Proposed factors include climate change leading to drought and agricultural failure, systems collapse where interconnection created vulnerability, migrations and invasions by displaced populations, technological changes, ironworking disrupting bronze-based economies, earthquakes and natural disasters, social upheaval, and internal rebellions. Most likely the collapse resulted from multiple factors reinforcing each other. Climate stress led to food shortages, which triggered social unrest and migrations, which disrupted trade networks, which caused economic collapse, which prevented recovery. The very interconnection that had made the late Bronze Age prosperous made it vulnerable. When problems occurred, they cascaded across the entire system. For our purposes, what matters is how this collapse was remembered and transmitted. The events of 1200 BCE CE were within historical time, documented in contemporary texts, and involving literate civilizations that left records. Yet, even with these advantages, memory of the collapse became fragmented and mythologized within just a few centuries. The Greek Dark Age that followed the Mesopotamian collapse lasted roughly 1100–1800 BCE. During this period, writing disappeared, population declined, material culture became simpler, the sophisticated palace economies vanished. When Greek civilization re-emerged in the Archaic period, it had little direct knowledge of the Mesopotamian world. What Greeks of the classical period knew about their Bronze Age past came through oral tradition, transmitted by poets, and eventually compiled by Homer in the Iliad and Odyssey. These epics preserved genuine memories, the existence of Troy, names of Mesopotamian kings, references to palace complexes, but mixed with mythology, theological interpretation, and narrative embellishment, historical reality, and legendary invention became inseparable. For 2.5 millennia, scholars treated the Iliad as pure fiction. Then Heinrich Schlein excavated Troy and Messene, demonstrating that the legendary cities were real places. Subsequent archaeology confirmed many details from Homer: the bow-tusk helmets, the specific geography, the existence of a Mesopotamian civilization powerful enough to launch the kind of expedition Homer describes. But Homer knew nothing of the collapse itself. The Iliad ends with Troy's fall, not with the destruction of the Mesopotamian world. The Odyssey describes supernatural adventures, not civilization ending catastrophe. The memory of the collapse was lost, even though the collapse occurred within historical time and was experienced by literate societies that could have documented it. What survived was fragmentary, airy references to returns of heroes finding their kingdoms destroyed, stories of migrations and new foundings, a general sense of previous kingdoms that no longer existed. But the systematic understanding of what happened, why it happened, and the scale of destruction was gone within a few hundred years. This demonstrates both the fragility and the resilience of cultural memory. Complete understanding was lost quickly. Within 3 or 4 centuries, Greeks couldn't read Linear B and had forgotten what their Bronze Age ancestors' palaces looked like. But fragmentary airy memory persisted for much longer. Names, places, the general outline of a heroic age, specific details like particular types of artifacts. If memory of a historical event from 1200 BCE became mythologized and fragmented within 400 years, what would memory of an event from 900 BCE look like? After 8,000 or 9,000 years, almost everything specific would be lost. What might survive would be the kind of stripped-down narrative we see in flood myths. There was a time before. There was a catastrophe. There were survivors. Civilization continued. The details that do survive across such time frames tend to be mnemonic, memorable because they're repetitive, formulaic, or emotionally significant. The 7 days of the flood, the sending of birds, The boat's measurements. These elements appear consistently across versions, not because they're necessarily historically accurate in detail, but because they're memorable patterns that help transmission. This is exactly what we see in the Sumerian flood narratives. They preserve a basic narrative structure, memorable, repetitive elements, and enough procedural detail to assist transmission, but they've lost historical specifics. They don't tell us who specifically survived, where exactly they came from, what their pre-flood society was actually like, or precise chronology. What they preserve is the catastrophe itself, its centrality to understanding history, and the concept that civilization continued through preservation rather than reinvention. The Bronze Age collapse also demonstrates that civilizational catastrophes do occur, can be sudden and comprehensive, and can be followed by reconstruction that eventually surpasses what was lost. The Greek Dark Age eventually gave way to classical Greek civilization, which in many ways exceeded Masonian achievement. But the reconstruction wasn't conscious restoration. Classical Greeks didn't deliberately rebuild Manian society. They created something new while unconsciously incorporating fragments of what survived. This might model what happened after the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Survivors didn't consciously restore Ice Age coastal civilizations. They couldn't. The coastlines were gone. The population was devastated. The knowledge base was disrupted. But they carried forward whatever could be salvaged. Concepts, techniques, social patterns, and eventually these contributed to the Neolithic Revolution and the emergence of post-Ice Age civilizations. The Sumerians claimed that their civilization was lowered from heaven again, might reflect genuine cultural memory of this process. Not that knowledge came literally from gods, but that it came from a time before, from survivors of catastrophe, from inheritance rather than invention. This is precisely what happened after the Bronze Age collapse. Knowledge wasn't invented anew, but was partially preserved and eventually restored. The critical difference is time frame. The Bronze Age collapse was 3,200 years ago, and its memory became mythologized within centuries. The Younger termination was 11,600 years ago. For memory to be transmitted across such a span, it would need to pass through roughly 400 generations, through multiple cultural transformations, through the transition from oral to written transmission, through languages that didn't exist when the original events occurred. Is such transmission possible? To answer this, we need to examine known cases of long-term cultural memory and the mechanisms that make such preservation feasible. Memory transmitted through ritual. Australian Aboriginal cultures maintain what are quite possibly the longest continuous oral traditions in the world. Some Aboriginal stories contain descriptions of landscapes that haven't existed for 10,000 years or more, coastlines before sea level rise, inland lakes that have been dry for millennia, volcanic eruptions that occurred in the deep past. Linguists and archaeologists working with Aboriginal communities have documented stories that align remarkably with geological events. Stories about the flooding of Spencer Gulf describe specific features that existed when the Gulf was dry during the Ice Age, but are now underwater. Stories about the Nullor Plain reference landmarks, now submerged by sea level rise. Stories about volcanic events in Victoria match geological dating of eruptions. These aren't vague mythological references. They're specific geographical descriptions that correspond to real features that haven't existed since the end of the Ice Age. The implication is that Aboriginal cultures have maintained oral traditions across more than 10,000 years, transmitting information about deep time events through roughly 400 generations. How is this possible? Several factors enable long-term oral transmission. First, repetition through ritual. Stories aren't told casually or inconsistently. They're performed in ceremonial contexts with established patterns. The performance itself becomes a mnemonic device. If you change the story, the rhythm breaks, the pattern fails, and listeners notice. This self-correcting mechanism helps maintain consistency across generations. Second, social importance. Stories that matter, that explain landscape features, that establish territorial rights, that provide survival information, are valued and carefully preserved. Elders teach them to youth in formal contexts. Initiates memorize them as part of their education. The stories aren't entertainment, they're essential knowledge. Third, multiple versions across communities. When stories are shared across multiple groups, each community maintains its own version. Variations exist, but core elements remain consistent because they're reinforced through intercom community contact. This creates redundancy. Even if one group's version becomes corrupted, others preserve the original. Fourth, embedding in landscape. Stories tied to specific geographical features are easier to preserve because the landscape itself serves as a mnemonic aid. When you can see the mountain, the river, the rock formation that the story describes, the story becomes anchored in physical reality rather than abstract memory. These mechanisms aren't unique to Aboriginal cultures. They appear across many traditional society. Polynesian navigators maintain detailed knowledge of ocean routes, star patterns, and island locations through oral transmission. Across centuries, Native American cultures preserved historical events, migration routes, and ecological knowledge orally for many generations before written documentation. The key is that oral transmission isn't the casual passing along of stories. It's a disciplined practice, often involving specialist knowledge keepers, formal teaching contexts, and cultural institutions that value accuracy. In such systems, information can be maintained much longer than we typically assume. When societies transition from oral to written transmission, another preservation mechanism becomes available. Writing allows information to be stored permanently rather than depending on living memory. But writing also introduces vulnerability. Records can be destroyed, lost, or become unreadable when language is chained. The Sumerian flood narratives benefit from both oral and written transmission. The stories were probably transmitted orally for unknown centuries before being written down. Once written, they were copied repeatedly by scribal schools where students learned cuneiform by copying classic texts. This created redundancy. The text existed in multiple copies across multiple cities, reducing the risk of complete loss. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition was remarkably conservative. Scribes didn't just copy contemporary texts. They maintained archives of ancient materials. When Ashurbanipal assembled his library at Nineveh in the 7th century BCE, he collected tablets from ancient archives and commissioned new copies of texts that were already centuries or millennia old. The Eridu Genesis was old when it was first written down. The Atrasis epic was ancient by Assyrian times, but the texts kept being copied because they were considered important. This deliberate preservation is why we can read these stories today. The last cuneiform scribe died 2,000 years ago, but the texts survived buried in ruins until modern archaeology rediscovered them. The physical durability of clay tablets, combined with institutional commitment to preservation, allowed transmission across 4,000 years of written history. For the flood narrative specifically, preservation was reinforced by their cultural importance. The flood wasn't a minor mythological detail. It was the central historical boundary, the dividing line between before and after. It appeared in king lists, in religious texts, in legal documents that dated events from before or after the flood. Its centrality meant it was constantly referenced, constantly retold, constantly reinforced in cultural memory. The same patterns appear in Egyptian transmission of ancient knowledge, which is relevant because Plato attributes the Atlantis story to Egyptian priestly sources. Egyptian civilization maintained written records continuously for more than 3,000 years, longer than any other known culture. Priestly archives preserved texts across dynasties, through invasions, through political upheavals. Egyptian priests in Plato's time had genuine access to ancient materials. When Greek historians visited Egypt, they encountered scholars who could read texts 1,000 or more years old. The priests who spoke with Solon weren't fabricating when they claimed access to deep-time records. Egypt did maintain knowledge longer than Greek civilization existed. This doesn't prove the Atlantis story is historically accurate. Egyptian records we can verify don't mention Atlantis, but it does mean that if Egyptian priests told Solon about an ancient catastrophic flood, they might have been drawing on genuine archival material. However fragmentary or mythologized it had become across millennia. The pattern of preservation through ritual and institutional memory explains how flood traditions could maintain core consistency across enormous timeframes. The stories weren't casually transmitted. They were formally preserved because they were considered crucial knowledge about the past. They were embedded in religious practices, in educational curricula, in cultural frameworks that valued continuity. This is why flood narratives appear so consistently across disparate cultures. Not necessarily because all cultures experienced the same localized flood and independently invented similar stories, but potentially because many cultures preserved memories of the same global catastrophe, filtered through different languages and frameworks, but maintaining core narrative elements. The elements that survive longest are procedurally memorable. The sending of birds, the 7 days, the mountain where the boat grounded. These are mnemonic structures helping transmission across generations. The elements that vary are culturally specific. God names, city names, theological interpretations. These are predictable variations as stories adapt to different contexts while maintaining structural consistency. What we see in the Sumerian and Greek sources matches this pattern. Consistent core narrative. Catastrophic flood destroying advanced civilization. Survivors preserving knowledge. Civilization restored. Variable cultural specifics. Different god names. Different geographical references. Different theological frameworks. This is exactly what we'd expect if both were preserving memories of a real event that occurred before either culture existed in its historically documented form. The question remains whether this interpretation is more plausible than the mainstream view that flood narratives are purely mythological responses to localized flooding events, or that they're theological allegories with no historical basis. To evaluate this, we need to synthesize all the evidence we've examined and assess the relative plausibility of different interpretations. 3 ways to read the water. We've examined Sumerian tablets, Plato's dialogues, archaeological excavations, geological records, and mechanisms of cultural transmission. Now, we need to step back and assess what these disparate pieces of evidence might mean when considered together. There are 3 main interpretive frameworks for understanding the flood narratives, each with strengths and weaknesses. Interpretation. 1. Pure mythology. The mainstream scholarly view is that flood narratives are mythological, possibly inspired by localized flooding events, but not preserving memory of any single historical catastrophe. In this view, the Sumerian floods referenced in texts correspond to archaeological flood deposits at Mesopotamian sites dating to various periods between 400 BCE. These were severe regional floods, devastating for local populations, but not global catastrophes. Cultural memory of these floods, combined with universal human experience of floods as dangerous and destructive, generated mythological narratives about a world-destroying deluge. The theological framework, God's deciding to destroy humanity, one righteous survivor preserved, is pure religious invention, explaining why floods occur and teaching moral lessons about divine judgment and human virtue. The procedural details, boat dimensions, bird sending, 7 days are narrative elaborations adding verisimilitude to the story without corresponding to historical events. Plato's Atlantis is philosophical allegory, invented to illustrate his ideas about ideal states and political corruption. The specific details, the concentric rings, the auricala medal, the 9,000-year timeline, are Platonic invention chosen for symbolic or aesthetic reasons rather than historical accuracy. No Egyptian sources mentioned Atlantis because the story didn't exist before Plato created it. The correspondence between these accounts and geological events around 9600 BCE is coincidence. Plato happened to choose a date that aligns with the Younger Dry termination. But he had no knowledge of Ice Age chronology or sea level rise. Strengths of this interpretation aligns with scholarly consensus across multiple disciplines, requires no revision of established archaeological chronologies, explains flood universality through common human experience, accounts for obvious mythological elements in the texts, doesn't depend on unverified underwater archaeology. Weaknesses of this interpretation: doesn't explain why flood narratives are so consistently structured across independent cultures, doesn't account for procedural details that don't serve obvious mythological function, doesn't explain the Sumerian emphasis on the flood as a real historical divider, requires dismissing Plato's attribution to Egyptian sources as complete fabrication, doesn't address why multiple tradition. In this view, the specific numbers in the narratives, 7 days 20 cubits 200 and 400. Antediluvian years are astronomical codes representing celestial cycles, precession of the equinoxes or cosmic time periods. Ancient cultures with sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded this information in mythological ical narratives to preserve it across generations. The flood itself might represent not literal water, but spiritual or consciousness-related transformation. The destruction and renewal cycle represents initiatory death and rebirth, the transition from one level of understanding to another. The procedural details are allegories for spiritual practices or philosophical concepts. Plato's Atlantis, in this view, represents an ideal spiritual state or a previous phase of human consciousness rather than a literal civilization. The concentric rings symbolize levels of reality or stages of initiation. The destruction represents the fall from a higher state into material existence. Strengths of this interpretation explains the mathematical precision of certain elements, accounts for why texts were carefully preserved and considered important, align with esoteric traditions in multiple cultures, explains symbolic consistency across versions, offers sophisticated rather than simplistic reading of ancient sources. Weaknesses of this interpretation requires assuming ancient cultures communicated primarily through coded symbolism rather than direct description. Many proposed decodings are speculative and unfalsifiable. Doesn't explain geographical correlations. Often reads modern concepts back into ancient texts anachronistically. Doesn't account for texts that claim to be his. In this view, catastrophic climate change and sea level rise at the end of the Younger Dryas approximately 9700–9600 BCE destroyed coastal settlements worldwide. While these settlements weren't civilizations equivalent to Bronze Age states, they were more sophisticated than conventionally assumed permanent or semi-permanent coastal communities with some degree of social organization, craft specialization, and accumulated knowledge. When these coastal populations were destroyed or displaced by rising seas, tsunamis, and environmental upheaval, survivors carried fragmented memories of what was lost. These memories were transmitted orally for thousands of years, becoming mythologized and theologized, but maintaining core narrative elements. There was a time before there was catastrophic flood. Survivors preserved knowledge. Civilization was restored. Different cultures preserved this memory differently. Mesopotamian cultures developing in a region prone to flooding and with cultural emphasis on written preservation maintained relatively detailed accounts that eventually were written down. Egyptian culture, valuing deep time continuity, preserved fragments in priestly traditions. Other cultures preserved the memory in their own mythological frameworks. Plato's account of Atlantis represents a Greek version of this widespread tradition, possibly derived from genuine Egyptian sources, however fragmentary, elaborated for philosophical purposes, but retaining chronological and catastrophic details that align with both the Mesopotamian accounts and the geological record. The procedural details in flood narratives, boat construction, bird sending, specific time frames are mnemonic devices that aided oral transmission, but might preserve fragments of practical knowledge from the actual catastrophe. The theological elements, divine decisions, moral judgments, supernatural interventions are later interpretive overlays, attempts by subsequent cultures to make sense of catastrophic events through their religious frameworks. Strengths of this interpretation counts chronological correspondence between different sources and geological evidence for both consistency and variation. Cross-traditions provides mechanism. Cultural memory of real events for narrative similarities. Align with known patterns of how historical events become mythologized. Compatible with archaeological evidence for rapid cultural changes at younger Dreyer's termination. Explains why flood narratives emphasize preservation and restoration rather than pure creation. Accounts for procedural details that don't serve obvious mythological functions. Requires accepting existence of sophisticated coastal societies that aren't currently documented. Archaeologically depends on each represents a different way of weighing the available information, different assumptions about what ancient texts represent, and different frameworks for connecting disparate pieces of evidence. The mainstream scholarly position, Interpretation 1, is likely correct in its skepticism about specifics. There probably wasn't a literal island called Atlantis with concentric water rings beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Sumerian antediluvian kings probably didn't literally rule for tens of thousands of years. The boat dimensions might not be exact specifications from an actual historical vessel. But mainstream skepticism about specifics doesn't necessarily invalidate the possibility that something real underlies these accounts. Historical events do become mythologized while retaining core accuracy. Troy was real, even though much of the Iliad is fictional. The Bronze Age collapse happened even though Greek memory of it became fragmentary and legendized. The question isn't whether every detail in Plato or the Sumerian tablets is historically accurate. The question is whether the overall pattern catastrophic flood destroyed civilization preserved memory might point towards something real that happened when the Ice Age ended, and that was remembered, however imperfectly, by the cultures that emerged afterward. The evidence examined in this investigation suggests this possibility deserves more serious consideration than it typically receives. The chronological correspondence is striking. The geological evidence for catastrophe is undeniable. The mechanisms for long-term cultural memory are better understood now than previously. The existence of submerged Ice Age landscapes that could have supported human populations is confirmed. Definitive proof would require finding and excavating submerged settlements from the terminal plane, analyzing their sophistication and determining whether they experienced catastrophic destruction around 9600 BCE. Such archaeological work is beginning but remains in early stages. Until it advances further, we're left with tantalizing correspondences rather than conclusive evidence. What we can say is that the flood narratives from Mesopotamia and Greece, considered alongside geological evidence for catastrophic environmental change at the younger destination, create a pattern that's difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Whether that pattern reflects genuine historical memory or is merely a remarkable accident of independent myth-making and chronological luck remains uncertain. But the uncertainty itself is meaningful. These ancient sources, preserved through centuries of careful copying, considered important enough to be housed in royal libraries and taught to students across generations, are trying to tell us something. Whether that something is literal, historical documentation, cultural mythology, encoded wisdom, or some combination of all three, it deserves our careful attention and our willingness to consider possibilities that conventional frameworks might too quickly dismiss. The question remains open, as all the most interesting questions do, the question that remains. In the vault beneath London, the tablet still rests among its companions. K3335. The Gilgamesh flood narrative that startled George Smith into removing his clothes in excitement. Around it sit tens of thousands of other tablets, king lists and business records, prayers and mathematical exercises, medical texts, and astronomical observations. The accumulated written memory of civilizations that spoke languages no one has spoken in 2,000 years. These tablets don't speak directly anymore. We read them through translation, through scholarly interpretation, through frameworks we bring to the ancient texts. but they remain physical objects that people made, that fingers pressed into wet clay, that survived fire and burial and rediscovery. They're not abstractions. They're artifacts of real people attempting to record what they considered important. Among what they considered important were accounts of a great flood. Not a minor local inconvenience, but the flood, the catastrophe that divided all history into before and after. They told this story repeatedly, copied it across centuries, maintained it alongside their business records and astronomical observations. It mattered to them in ways we can't fully recover. Across the Mediterranean, in dialogues written by a Greek philosopher, another account of catastrophic destruction. An advanced civilization lost in a day and night of earthquake and flood. The date given 9,000 years before the account was transmitted, which places it at the same moment, geological records show the last ice age ended in dramatic environmental upheaval. These correspondences might be meaningful. They might preserve fragmented memories of something real. Coastal civilizations destroyed when Ice Age geography transformed. Survivors carrying forward knowledge, cultures eventually emerging that maintained stories about the time before the waters rose. The geological catastrophe is unquestionable. Whether human societies sophisticated enough to be remembered existed in the affected regions remains uncertain, or these correspondences might be accidental. Humans universally experience flooding, develop mythologies about water's destructive power, independently create narratives about divine judgment through deluge. The dates might align through coincidence, or through Plato's arbitrary selection of a round number for rhetorical purposes. The procedural details might be narrative embellishments, adding verisimilitude to invented stories. We can't know with certainty, not with current evidence. The settlements that would prove the case are underwater, buried under meters of marine sediment on continental shelves we've barely begun to explore systematically. The textual sources are fragmentary, filtered through cultural frameworks very different from ours, simultaneously more and less reliable than we'd like. What we can do is hold the question open, not forcing conclusions prematurely, not dismissing possibilities because they challenge conventional frameworks, but also not accepting speculation as proven fact. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The patterns are intriguing, but not definitive. The question is legitimate, but not yet answerable. This uncertainty is itself meaningful. It reminds us how much of the human past remains genuinely mysterious, how much we don't know about what happened before the emergence of civilizations we can document archaeologically. The historical record we can verify with confidence extends back roughly 5,000 years to the beginning of written documentation. Before that, we have material culture, but limited ability to reconstruct social complexity, belief systems, or historical narratives. The gap between 30,000 BCE and 900 BC represents 6,900 years of human existence, about which we know remarkably little. We know humans existed. We know they created art, buried their dead, domesticated plants and animals, built structures, but we don't know the full range of social complexity they achieved, the knowledge they accumulated, the disasters they experienced, or the memories they maintained. The flood narratives from Sa and Greece might be windows into that unknown period, not transparent windows offering clear views, but frosted glass through which we can make out shapes and movements without seeing details. Something happened. Something significant enough to be remembered across extraordinary spans of time. Something involving water, destruction, survival, and the reconstitution of society afterward. Whether that something was a single global catastrophe, multiple regional disasters, or purely mythological invention, created to explain universal human experiences with flooding, we cannot yet say with certainty. What we can say is that the ancient sources deserve more careful consideration than they sometimes receive. They're not random inventions. They're sustained cultural traditions maintained across centuries by societies that distinguish between different types of claims, and that took their historical knowledge seriously. The Sumerians weren't credulous primitives believing any story they heard. They were sophisticated mathematicians, administrators, engineers. They built cities, managed complex irrigation systems, tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. When they recorded that there was a time before the flood and that civilization was restored afterward, they might have been preserving genuine cultural memory, however mythologized it became through transmission. Plato wasn't a fantasist inventing random stories. He was one of history's most rigorous thinkers, concerned with truth, justice, and the proper understanding of reality. When he attributed the Atlantis account to Egyptian sources and dated it to 9,000 years before Solon, he might have been working from some fragment of genuine tradition, however much he elaborated it for philosophical purposes, or they might both have been creating mythological narratives with no historical basis. And the correspondences we've observed are coincidental. This remains possible. Absence of proof isn't proof of absence, but it's also not proof of presence. We're left with uncertainty. That uncertainty is where we should rest for now. Not claiming certainty we don't have, not dismissing possibilities prematurely, but acknowledging that the question of what really happened at the end of the Ice Age, what societies existed before the ones we can document, and whether catastrophic memories can be preserved across such enormous time frames remains genuinely open. The tablets remain in their vaults. The dialogues remain in libraries. The geological evidence remains in ice cores and sediment layers and submerged shorelines. The question remains suspended between what we can prove and what we can imagine, between documented history and preserved memory, between the known and the mysterious. If you're still listening, wherever you are, perhaps you're settling into sleep now. Perhaps these questions are drifting through your mind, not demanding answers, but inviting contemplation. What did the ancient world lose? What did survivors preserve? What stories do we tell ourselves about where we came from and what we've forgotten? The answers, if they exist, rest beneath the waves on continental shelves where Ice Age coastlines drowned, in marine sediments accumulating for 11,000 years, in archives we haven't excavated, in sites we haven't found, in evidence we haven't yet learned how to interpret. Until we find those answers, if we ever do, we have the stories. The tablets pressed in clay, the dialogues preserved through copying, the consistent narrative across cultures separated by time and distance. There was a world before, there was catastrophe, there was restoration. Whether those stories are history or mythology or something in between, they remind us that human civilization is more fragile than we usually acknowledge and more resilient than we often realize. Catastrophes do occur, civilizations do fall, but knowledge can be preserved, memory can be maintained, and what was lost can sometimes be restored. The question of what really destroyed Atlantis. If Atlantis represents anything real, is the question of what happened when the ancient world changed, when ice turned to water, when coastlines drowned, when the geography that humans had known for tens of thousands of years transformed within lifetimes. We know something happened. We know it was catastrophic. We know it was global. We know it was sudden in geological terms. We know it affected coastlines worldwide. We know human populations would have been impacted. What we don't know is whether those populations had developed social complexity, sophisticated enough to merit being called civilizations, whether they were destroyed comprehensively enough to be remembered as catastrophe rather than gradual change, and whether survivors preserved memories that eventually were written down by cultures that emerged thousands of years later. The Sumerian records and Plato's dialogues suggest this might be what happened. The geological evidence confirms the catastrophe occurred when both sources date it. The mechanisms of cultural transmission make long-term memory plausible, if not certain. But suggestion, plausibility, and correspondence aren't proof. They're invitation to keep investigating, to take ancient sources seriously as potential historical documents, rather than dismissing them as pure mythology. To consider that the earliest civilizations we can document might have been restoring something rather than inventing it. To hold open the possibility that the human story extends further back and includes more complexity than conventional chronologies allow. The invitation is open. The question remains. The mystery persists, as the deepest mysteries always do, hovering between what we can know and what we can only wonder, between the preserved fragments and the lost whole, between memory and history, between the documented past and the drowned world. The waters rose. The world changed. The survivors remembered. And we inheritors of what they preserved are still trying to understand what they were trying to tell us about what came before, what was lost, and how the world they knew ended. The answer, if it exists, waits beneath the waves.